Hello, creatures of the night. Welcome to the channel where fear meets fun. Before we begin our macabre journey today, I want to ask you to leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'll love reading your response. Don't forget to hit the like button and get ready to sleep with plenty of fear. All because the crunch of gravel under my tires faded to silence as I pulled into the small clearing that would be my home for the next few days. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, inhaling deeply. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs, a welcome change from the exhaust-choked air of Boston. I stepped out of my car, stretching my arms above my head. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with patches of golden light. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint sound of a distant stream. Just what the doctor ordered, I murmured to myself, already feeling the tension of city life melting away. I popped the trunk and began unloading my gear. The familiar routine of setting up camp was soothing, each action automatic after years of weekend escapes to the wilderness. As I hammered the last tent peg into the soft earth, I surveyed my handiwork with satisfaction. Home sweet home, I grinned, hands on my hips. The growl of my stomach reminded me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I checked my watch, still a few hours until sunset. Plenty of time to gather some firewood and get dinner started. I grabbed my hatchet and a length of rope, then set off into the woods surrounding my campsite. The White Mountain National Forest was a place of raw beauty, untamed and wild. Each step took me deeper into a world that seemed untouched by time. As I gathered fallen branches and chopped smaller logs, my mind wandered. This solo camping trip was meant to be a reset, a chance to clear my head and figure out my next move. At 32, I was feeling increasingly trapped in my corporate job, the days blending into a monotonous blur of meetings and deadlines. Lost in thought, I almost missed it. A glint of something not quite natural caught my eye, half buried beneath a thick carpet of fallen leaves. Curious, I knelt down, brushing aside the detritus of the forest floor. My fingers touched weathered leather, cracked and peeling with age. I carefully extracted the object from its earthy bed, revealing a book, its pages yellowed and warped by time and the elements. "What the hell?" I muttered, turning the book over in my hands. It was a diary, or journal of some kind, its cover unmarked save for the ravages of age. A part of me knew I should leave it where I found it. This was government land after all, and removing anything was technically illegal, but curiosity got the better of me. I tucked the book into my jacket pocket, finished gathering my firewood, and headed back to camp. As night began to fall, I got a fire going and heated up some beans and hot dogs. Hardly gourmet, but it hit the spot. The flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing, and a chorus of crickets and nightbirds filled the air. With dinner done and dishes washed, I settled into my camp chair, pulled out my flashlight, and retrieved the mysterious diary from my pocket. The leather cover was cool and rough beneath my fingers as I carefully opened it to the first page. The handwriting was spidery and faded, but still legible. I leaned closer, adjusting my flashlight to better illuminate the words. August 15th, 1692. I write this in desperation and fear, for I know not how long I have left in this world. My name is Sarah Goodwin, and I am accused of a most heinous crime: witchcraft. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. 1692, the height of the witch trials. I knew my New England history well enough to recognize the significance of the date. Captivated, I read on. I have fled Salem, hoping to find sanctuary in these wild mountains, but I fear my pursuers are close behind. Last night, I witnessed a sight that still haunts me. A man, John Proctor, I believe, was dragged into this very clearing by a mob. They accused him of consorting with the devil, of signing his name in the black man's book. I watched, hidden and trembling, as I stopped reading, my blood running cold. The diary described, in gruesome detail, the torture and execution of John Proctor, in the very spot where I now sat. "This has to be some kind of joke," I said aloud, trying to laugh it off. probably left by some horror writer wannabe. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The book was far too old, the details too specific and archaic to be a modern fabrication. I glanced up from the diary, suddenly aware of how dark it had become. The fire had died down to embers, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to have grown deeper, more menacing. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond my tent. I jumped, my heart racing. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response came save for the whisper of wind through the trees and the faint, mocking echo of my own voice. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush, but nothing more. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. "Get a grip, Jessica," I muttered to myself. "It's just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon." But the chill that ran down my spine told a different story. With shaking hands, I zipped up my tent, creating a flimsy barrier between myself and whatever lurked in the night. Inside my sleeping bag, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. It was just an old book, probably full of folklore and superstition. There was no reason to be afraid. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words from the diary swimming before me, telling of death and darkness in this very spot. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What if the story in the diary was true? And if it was, what other horrors might be waiting to be discovered in the pages of that weathered old book? The wind picked up outside, rustling the leaves of the forest. But beneath that familiar sound, I could have sworn I heard something else. A whisper, faint but distinct, calling my name from the darkness beyond the thin walls of my tent. I awoke to the sound of rain pattering against my tent. Groggily, I reached for my phone to check the time. 6:17 a.m. I groaned, rolling over in my sleeping bag. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The diary, the eerie feeling of being watched. In the light of day, it all seemed ridiculous. "Get it together, Jess," I muttered to myself. It's just an old book. I unzipped the tent flap, ready to start my day, but the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. My campsite, which I'd meticulously set up yesterday, was in complete disarray. The camp chairs were overturned, my cooler lay on its side with its contents strewn about, and my carefully stacked firewood was scattered across the clearing. "What the hell?" I breathed, stepping out into the drizzle. I surveyed the damage, my mind racing. Had a bear gotten into the camp overnight? But there was no sign of claw marks, no torn packaging from the food. It was as if a tornado had swept through, disturbing everything but my tent. As I began to clean up, a nagging thought wormed its way into my mind. The diary. I rushed back to my tent, digging through my backpack until my fingers closed around the weathered leather cover. It was still there, undisturbed. The sound of car engines in the distance snapped me out of my reverie. My friends were arriving. I hastily shoved the diary back into my pack and finished tidying up as best I could. 2 cars pulled into the clearing. From the first, my best friend Lisa emerged, her curly red hair bouncing as she hopped out. "Jess!" she called, waving enthusiastically. "Ready for a weekend of roughing it?" Behind her, Mark and Sarah climbed out, stretching after the long drive. From the second car came the booming voice of Big Mike. Hey, let's get this party started." His girlfriend, Tina, rolled her eyes good-naturedly as she joined him. I plastered on a smile, pushing aside my unease. "Hey, guys, glad you made it." As they unloaded their gear, Lisa sidled up to me. "You okay, Jess? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated, then decided to come clean. "You're not going to believe this, but the weirdest thing happened last night." I recounted my discovery of the diary and the state I'd found the camp in this morning. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism growing on their faces. Mark was the first to speak up. "Come on, Jess, you probably just had too much to drink and messed up the camp yourself." "I didn't even bring any alcohol," I protested. Sarah chimed in. Maybe it was just the wind. It got pretty gusty last night. I shook my head. No, this was different. Here, let me show you the diary. I retrieved the book from my tent and showed it to my friends. They passed it around, flipping through the pages with mild interest. Big Mike chuckled. This is some Blair Witch Project shit right here. You sure you didn't plant this yourself to spice up the weekend? No, I exclaimed, frustration building. Look, I know how it sounds, but... Lisa cut me off with a gentle hand on my arm. Jess, honey, it's okay. It's probably just an elaborate prank someone set up. Let's not let it ruin our weekend, all right? I wanted to argue further, but I could see I was fighting a losing battle. Yeah, you're right, I conceded, forcing a laugh. Pretty good prank, though, right? The tension broken, everyone set about setting up their tents and organizing the campsite. As the day wore on, the incident began to feel more and more distant, like a half-remembered dream. After lunch, we decided to go for a hike deeper into the forest. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a fresh, crisp scent in the air. As we walked, the conversation flowed freely, filled with jokes and stories. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, as if we were being watched. We paused at a bubbling creek to refill our water bottles. As I knelt by the water's edge, I froze. There, reflected in the clear surface of the creek, was a pale face. Not my own, but that of a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Jess? Sarah's voice cut through my panic. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a smile. Yeah, just thought I saw something in the water. Trick of the light, I guess. As we made our way back to camp, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Despite the beauty, I felt a growing sense of dread. Back at the campsite, as the others prepared dinner, I slipped away to my tent. I needed to look at the diary again to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. As I opened the book, a loose page fell out, one I was certain I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was the same spidery script, but the ink looked fresher, almost wet. My blood ran cold as I read, 5 come to the cursed ground, unaware of the fate that awaits them. The red-haired one laughs, the tall one doubts, the lovers embrace, and the seeker trembles. The wheel turns again, as it has for centuries. It was an exact description of our day, down to the smallest detail. But how was that possible? The diary was centuries old. A call from outside interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Jess, dinner's ready. I quickly shoved the diary and the loose page into my backpack. Coming, I called back, my voice shaky. As I emerged from the tent, I saw my friends gathered around the campfire, plates of food in hand, laughing and joking. They looked so normal, so unaware of the darkness that seemed to be closing in around us. Big Mike raised his beer in a toast. To a weekend of adventure, the others cheered, but I couldn't bring myself to join in. As night fell and the forest grew dark around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that our real adventure, and our real danger, was just beginning. Later that night, as I lay in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest, I heard a whisper on the wind. It might have been my imagination, but it sounded like a woman's voice, soft and menacing. Welcome to my woods, seekers. Your journey has only just begun. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But deep down I knew. Something ancient and malevolent had awakened in these woods, and somehow I had a feeling it was all my fault. The witching hour. That's what my grandmother used to call it, that dead time between 3 and 4 a.m. when the veil between worlds is thinnest. I never believed in such superstitions, but as I jolted awake to the sound of a blood-curdling scream, I wondered if maybe I should have. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for my flashlight. The scream had come from outside, echoing through the trees and setting my nerves on edge. I unzipped my tent with shaking hands, poking my head out into the moonlit clearing. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is everyone okay?" The campsite erupted into chaos. Tent zippers rasped open, and confused voices filled the air. Lisa emerged first, her red hair a tangled mess. "What the hell was that?" she asked, eyes wide with fear. Before I could answer, Sarah's panicked voice cut through the night. "Mark? Mark, where are you?" We gathered in the center of the clearing, flashlight beams dancing wildly as we searched for our missing friend. The fire had long since died out, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate the scene. "There!" Big Mike shouted, pointing towards the tree line. Our lights converged on a figure huddled at the base of a massive oak tree. It was Mark, his face ashen, eyes wide and unfocused. We rushed over, Tina kneeling beside him. "Mark? Honey, what happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with fear. Mark's gaze snapped to her, then darted around wildly, as if searching for something in the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I saw her. She was standing right there, watching me." A chill ran down my spine. "Who, Mark? Who did you see?" His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. A woman, in a tattered dress. She was just standing there, staring at me. And then she smiled. Sarah wrapped a blanket around Mark's shoulders. "It was just a nightmare, sweetie. You must have been sleepwalking." But I knew better. The diary, the strange occurrences, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple bad dream. We managed to coax Mark back to his tent, but none of us felt much like sleeping after that. We huddled around the rekindled campfire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds, we began to relax. The horrors of the night seemed less real in the light of day. But when I went to check on Mark, I found his tent empty. "Guys," I called out, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Has anyone seen Mark this morning?" The others gathered around, confusion turning to concern as we realized Mark was nowhere to be found. We split up to search the campsite, calling his name. It was Tina who found it. A scrap of paper pinned to a tree with Mark's pocket knife. 2 words were scrawled across it in jagged, desperate letters. "She's real." "Oh God," Tina sobbed, sinking to her knees. "What's happening?" I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the words stuck in my throat, because I knew deep down that nothing about this situation was okay. We spent the next few hours combing the woods around our campsite, calling Mark's name until our voices grew hoarse. As we searched, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Strange symbols carved into the trees, just like those described in the diary I'd found. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking, "I think we need to get out of here. Now." But Lisa shook her head firmly. "We can't leave, Jess, not without Mark." "Yeah," Big Mike chimed in. "What if he's hurt? We can't just abandon him." I wanted to scream, to make them understand the danger we were in. But I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. As we neared a steep cliff edge, Sarah suddenly called out, "Look, over there." We rushed forward, hope and dread warring in our hearts. There, caught on a gnarled branch jutting out from the cliff face, was Mark's backpack. It was torn and stained with what looked horribly like blood. Tina let out a strangled sob. "No. Oh God, no." Big Mike peered over the edge of the cliff, his face grim. "I don't see any sign of him down there. Maybe he dropped his pack and kept going." But we all knew it was a false hope. The amount of blood on the backpack told a grim story. As we made our way back to camp, defeated and shell-shocked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful yesterday, now felt oppressive and threatening. Back at the campsite, we gathered around the fire pit, no one quite sure what to do next. The gravity of the situation hung over us like a dark cloud. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, breaking the heavy silence. Lisa nodded in agreement. Yeah, and park rangers. They'll know how to handle this. But when we tried our phones, we found no signal. Even Big Mike's satellite phone, which he'd brought for emergencies, refused to connect. This is impossible, he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. We had signal yesterday. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I knew then with absolute certainty that whatever force had taken Mark wasn't going to let us leave easily. As night began to fall once more, tension filled the air. None of us wanted to sleep, afraid of what might happen in the darkness. Maybe we should take shifts, I suggested. 2 people stay awake while the others rest. The others agreed, and we set up a rotation. As I took the first watch with Lisa, I couldn't help but think about the diary, safely hidden in my backpack. I knew I should tell the others everything, but I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. Jess, Lisa said softly, breaking into my thoughts. What's really going on here? You've been acting strange ever since we arrived. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Lisa, there's something I need to tell you. About that diary I found. But before I could continue, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest, cutting off my words. It wasn't the cry of any animal I'd ever heard before. It was filled with rage and hunger and something that sounded terrifyingly human. Lisa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What was that? I shook my head, words failing me. Because I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever had made that sound was coming for us next. As we huddled closer to the fire, I realized with growing horror that our nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as the shadows grew longer and the night pressed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all going to meet the same fate as Mark, unless we could unravel the mystery of the diary and the dark history of these cursed woods. Sleep eluded me as the night wore on. The others had finally succumbed to exhaustion, their soft snores a counterpoint to the eerie silence of the forest. But I couldn't close my eyes. Not with the diary calling to me from my backpack, its secrets burning a hole in my conscience. With trembling hands, I retrieved the weathered book and slipped out of my tent. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I settled into a camp chair, flicked on my headlamp, and opened the diary. Okay, Sarah, I whispered to the night. Let's see what other horrors you've got for me. The spidery handwriting danced in the beam of my light as I delved deeper into Sarah's story. Hours passed as I pieced together the tragic tale of a woman wrongfully accused of witchcraft in the late 1600s. July 14th, 1692, I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. They came for me today. The accusations are false, but in these dark times, truth matters little. I flee into the wilderness praying for sanctuary, but I fear my persecutors are close behind. My heart ached for Sarah as I read of her desperate flight into these very woods. But as I turned the page, the story took a dark turn. August 1st, 1692. I am changed. The forest has shown me secrets, whispered to me of power beyond mortal ken. If they wish to name me witch, then a witch I shall become. They will rue the day they drove me to this. A chill ran down my spine as I read Sarah's descent into darkness. The diary detailed rituals performed under moonlight, sacrifices made to entities I dared not name. And with each passing entry, the deaths began. Oh, Sarah, I murmured. What did you do? Jess? Lisa's voice made me jump. She emerged from her tent, rubbing sleep from her eyes. What are you doing up? I hesitated, then decided to come clean. I couldn't sleep. I've been reading the diary. Lisa sat down beside me, her face etched with concern. And I took a deep breath. It's worse than we thought, Liz. The woman who wrote this, Sarah. She was accused of witchcraft back in 1692. She fled here to these woods, but something happened to her. Something changed her. Lisa's brow furrowed. Changed her how? She became what they accused her of being. A witch, and not the good kind. I swallowed hard, Lisa, I think she's still here. I think she's what's been causing all of this. To my surprise, Lisa didn't immediately dismiss me. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about these woods, about a vengeful spirit that preyed on campers and hikers. I always thought they were just scary stories to keep us kids in line, but now..." A twig snapped in the darkness beyond our camp, making us both jump. We peered into the gloom, but saw nothing. "We need to tell the others," Lisa said, her voice shaking slightly. I nodded. "At first light. For now, let's..." A scream cut through the night, jolting everyone awake. We all scrambled out of our tents, hearts pounding. "What's happening?" Sarah cried, clinging to Big Mike. Tina pointed towards the tree line, her hand shaking. There! I saw something." We all turned to look. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman, her dress tattered and stained, her long dark hair wild and matted. But it was her eyes that held me transfixed. They glowed with an unholy light. "Sarah," I breathed. The apparition smiled, a terrible, hungry expression. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished. Chaos erupted in the camp. Everyone was talking at once, voices rising in panic and disbelief. "Enough!" I shouted, surprising even myself with the force of my voice. When everyone fell silent, I continued. "There's something I need to tell you all. About the diary. About this place. About everything." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I told them Sarah's story. I showed them the diary, the entries detailing the horrors that had occurred in these woods over centuries. "So you're saying we're being haunted by a 300-year-old witch?" Big Mike asked, his usual bravado noticeably subdued. I nodded grimly. "I know it sounds crazy, but after what we just saw..." "It explains the symbols on the trees," Sarah said quietly. "I noticed them yesterday but didn't want to say anything. I thought I was imagining things." Tina, who had been silent throughout my explanation, suddenly gasped. "Oh God," she whispered, her face pale. "I just remembered something. Last night, before Mark disappeared, I woke up and saw him standing outside the tent. He was talking to someone, but I couldn't see who. I thought I was dreaming, so I went back to sleep. But what if..." A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications of Tina's words sank in. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Now." But as we started to pack up our camp, a fierce wind whipped through the clearing. The trees around us groaned and creaked, their branches seeming to reach for us like grasping fingers. "She's not going to let us leave," I realized aloud, my heart sinking. As if in response to my words, an unearthly wail echoed through the forest. We huddled together, watching in horror as spectral figures began to materialize at the edge of our camp. Men and women in old-fashioned clothes, their faces twisted in agony and rage. "The souls of those she's taken," I whispered, remembering a passage from the diary. "She's using them to keep us here." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I clutched the diary to my chest, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, a way to end this centuries-old cycle of violence and revenge. "We need to find Sarah's grave," I said, the idea forming even as I spoke. The diary mentioned a hidden graveyard deep in the woods. If we can find it, maybe we can put her to rest. "And if we can't?" Big Mike asked. I met his gaze, seeing my own fear reflected in his eyes. "Then we might end up joining Mark and all the others she's taken over the years." As we gathered what supplies we could and prepared to venture deeper into the haunted forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, but we had no choice. Our only hope of survival lay in unraveling the mystery of Sarah Goodwin and putting her tormented spirit to rest. With one last look at our abandoned campsite, we set off into the woods, the diary clutched tightly in my hands. Whatever horrors awaited us, whatever dark secrets these ancient trees held, we would face them together. and somehow, some way, we would find a way to break the curse of White Mountain National Forest. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ventured deeper into its heart. What had once been a peaceful sanctuary now felt like a green prison, with every tree and shadow harboring potential danger. We moved in a tight group, jumping at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. I nodded grimly. I've felt it since we found the diary. Like there are eyes everywhere. As if to confirm our fears, a low moan echoed through the trees, sending shivers down our spines. We quickened our pace, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation. Suddenly, Lisa stopped in her tracks. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you see that?" We all turned to look where she was pointing. For a moment there was nothing but dense foliage. Then, a shadow seemed to detach itself from a tree, moving with unnatural fluidity before disappearing into the underbrush. "Oh, God," Tina whimpered. "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It wasn't human. It was too raw, too primal. The sound reverberated through the forest, setting birds to flight and sending small animals scurrying for cover. "Run!" Big Mike yelled, grabbing Tina's hand. We took off, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Branches whipped at our faces and roots threatened to trip us, but terror lent speed to our feet. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst into a small clearing, gasping for breath. Is everyone okay?" I panted, doing a quick head count. Nods and murmured affirmations answered me, but the relief was short-lived. As we caught our breath, an eerie stillness settled over the clearing. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. "Guys," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." We followed her gaze to the center of the clearing. There, arranged in a perfect circle, were small piles of stones. Each pile was topped with a human skull, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare accusingly at us. "What the hell?" Big Mike breathed, taking an involuntary step back. I approached the macabre display, the diary clutched tightly in my hands. As I got closer, I noticed symbols carved into each skull, the same symbols we'd seen on the trees. "It's a warning," I said, my mouth dry with fear. "She's trying to scare us off." Lisa joined me, her face pale but determined. "Well, it's working. But we can't turn back now, can we?" I shook my head. "No. We have to end this, or we'll never get out of these woods alive." As night began to fall, we decided to make camp in the clearing. Despite the grisly decoration, it felt safer than pressing on in the darkness. We set up our tents and built a fire, though its cheerful crackling did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. "I'll take first watch," I volunteered, settling down by the fire with the diary. The others murmured their agreement and retreated to their tents, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of our labored breathing as we trudged back to camp, defeated and terrified after our failed attempt to find Sarah's grave. "We should have never come here," Sarah muttered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Big Mike put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "We'll figure this out. We always do." But his voice lacked its usual confidence. We all knew we were in way over our heads. As we entered the clearing where we'd set up camp, Lisa suddenly stopped short. "Guys," she whispered, "where's Tina?" A jolt of panic shot through me. How had we not noticed she was missing? We'd been so focused on getting back to camp, on trying to come up with a new plan. "Tina?" Big Mike called out, his deep voice echoing through the trees. "Tina, where are you?" A rustling sound came from behind Tina and Mark's tent. We all tensed, ready to run if Sarah's ghost made another appearance. But it was Tina who emerged, her movements stiff and unnatural. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by unease. Something was off about her. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, her skin pale as death. "Tina?" I said cautiously, taking a step towards her. "Are you okay?" When she spoke, my blood ran cold. Her voice was different, deeper, with an odd accent that sounded centuries old. "Tina is not here," she said, her lips curving into a cruel smile. "But I am." Lisa gasped. "Oh my God." Sarah? Tina, or rather the entity possessing her, turned to face Lisa. "'Tis I, Sarah Goodwin, whom you and yours have so rudely awakened." I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, please. We mean you no harm. We just want to help you find peace." Sarah's laughter coming from Tina's mouth was harsh and bitter. "Peace? There be no peace for the likes of me, girl. Not after what was done to me." "But it wasn't us," Big Mike protested. "We had nothing to do with what happened to you." Sarah's eyes flashed with an otherworldly light. "Did you not? Your ancestors were among those who hunted me, who drove me to this cursed place. Their blood runs in your veins, and for that, you must pay the price." As she spoke, the wind began to pick up, whipping through the clearing with unnatural force. Dark clouds rolled in, blotting out the sun and plunging us into an eerie twilight. "Please," I begged. "There must be something we can do to make this right, to help you move on." Sarah turned her gaze to me, and I felt the weight of centuries of pain and rage bearing down on me. "You wish to help? Then suffer as I have suffered. Watch as all you love is torn away, as you are forced to linger in this world long past your time." With a gesture from Sarah, Tina's body rose into the air, hovering several feet off the ground. When she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I will show you the truth of my story, the horror of my fate. And then, when you understand the depth of my suffering, you will beg for the sweet release of death." Images began to flash before our eyes. Visions of a colonial village, of angry mobs and terrified women being dragged to the gallows. We saw Sarah, young and beautiful, fleeing into the forest. We felt her terror, her desperation, and then we saw her transformation, the dark rituals she performed, the sacrifices she made to entities beyond our comprehension. We witnessed the deaths she caused over the centuries, the souls she trapped to fuel her vengeance. When the visions faded, we all stood there, shaken to our cores. Tina lowered herself back to the ground, a triumphant smile on her face. "Now you see," she said. "Now you understand." Lisa, tears streaming down her face, stepped forward. "Sarah, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. It was wrong, all of it. But please, this has to end. You can't keep punishing innocent people for the crimes of the past." For a moment, something like doubt flickered in Sarah's eyes, but then her expression hardened once more. "Innocent? There be no innocence in this world, girl. Only victims and oppressors." Suddenly, Tina's body convulsed. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed to the ground. We rushed to her side, but before we could reach her, she sat up abruptly, gasping for air. "Tina," Big Mike said cautiously, "is that you?" Tina looked around wildly, her eyes wide with fear. What happened?" Oh God, I saw terrible things." As we helped Tina to her feet, trying to calm her down, a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the clearing. Sarah's voice, no longer coming from Tina, seemed to surround us. "Your friend was but a vessel, a taste of what's to come. The real game is yet to begin." Thunder crashed overhead and rain began to pour down in sheets, but this was no ordinary storm. The raindrops hissed and steamed where they hit the ground, and I could have sworn I saw faces forming in the clouds, twisted in agony. "We need to get out of here," Sarah shouted over the howling wind. "Now!" We grabbed what we could and ran, our feet slipping on the muddy ground. But no matter which direction we took, we always seemed to end up back at the campsite. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, trapping us in this nightmare. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, we huddled together under the meager shelter of a large tree. The storm raged on around us, unnatural and terrifying. "What are we going to do?" Lisa asked, her voice barely audible over the tempest. I clutched the diary to my chest, my mind racing. There had to be a way out of this, a way to break Sarah's curse. But as I looked at the frightened faces of my friends, I realized with a sinking heart that I had no idea how to save us. "I don't know," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I just don't know." As if in response to my despair, a bolt of lightning struck a nearby tree. The ancient oak split down the middle with a deafening crack, and in the splintered trunk, illuminated by the storm's fury, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Faces, dozens of them, screaming silently from within the wood. The trapped souls of Sarah's victims, their torment etched into the very fabric of the forest. "Oh my God," Tina whispered, her voice shaking. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" As we stared in horror at the grisly sight before us, I couldn't help but wonder if we were destined to join those poor souls. If our faces would soon be added to the grim gallery of Sarah's victims, trapped for eternity in this cursed forest. The storm intensified, the wind howling with inhuman voices, and somewhere in that maelstrom, I could have sworn I heard Sarah's laughter, triumphant and terrible. Our ordeal was far from over. In fact, I feared it was only just beginning. And as the night closed in around us, I wondered if any of us would live to see the dawn. The storm raged on through the night, an unnatural tempest that seemed to feed off our fear. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the clouds, we were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and teetering on the edge of despair. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "We have to make a run for it." Lisa looked at me, her usually vibrant red hair plastered to her pale face. "And go where, Jess? We don't even know which way is out anymore." She had a point. The forest seemed to shift and change around us, paths disappearing and reappearing at will. But staying put wasn't an option either. Big Mike stood up, his imposing frame a welcome sight in our dire circumstances. "I say we pick a direction and just go. Better than waiting around to become ghost food." We all nodded in agreement. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. As we gathered what little remained of our supplies, Tina suddenly gasped, "Guys, look!" We followed her gaze to the edge of the clearing. There, barely visible through the mist and rain, stood a figure. It was Sarah, her spectral form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. "She's showing us the way out," Tina whispered, a note of hope in her voice. But I wasn't so sure. "Or leading us into a trap," I muttered. Sarah's ghost turned and drifted into the woods. Without any better options, we followed. The forest seemed to come alive around us as we ran. Branches whipped at our faces, roots rose up to trip us, and the wind howled with inhuman voices. It was as if the entire forest was trying to stop us from leaving. "Keep going," I shouted, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "Don't look back." But it was hard not to. Every few seconds I caught glimpses of shadowy figures flitting between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. The trapped souls of Sarah's victims, I realized with a chill. We ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, our legs aching. The ghost of Sarah always stayed just ahead, leading us deeper and deeper into the woods. Suddenly, Sarah stopped. We skidded to a halt, gasping for breath. "Why are we stopping?" Sarah, our Sarah, not the ghost, panted. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Trees groaned and swayed, their roots writhing like snakes. "Run!" I screamed, but it was too late. The forest floor buckled and heaved, sending us sprawling. When I looked up, I realized with horror that the trees had moved, forming an impenetrable wall around us. "No," Lisa whimpered. "No, no, no." We were trapped in a clearing we hadn't seen before, and at its center stood an ancient gnarled tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was twisted into grotesque shapes, almost like faces frozen in agony. The ghost of Sarah appeared before the tree, her form more solid now. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome to my sanctuary," she said, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "The heart of my power, where the veil between worlds is thinnest." I struggled to my feet, the diary clutched tightly to my chest. "Why are you doing this, Sarah? We've done nothing to you." Sarah's eyes flashed with centuries-old rage. "You've done everything. Your kind hunted me, persecuted me, drove me to this, and now you shall pay the price." With a gesture from Sarah, the grotesque tree began to move. Its branches reached out like grasping hands, and I could hear screams echoing from within its trunk. "Oh God," Big Mike breathed. "Those are people in there." Sarah nodded, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "The souls of those who came before you, trapped for eternity, feeding my power, and soon you shall join them." As the branches reached for us, we scattered, desperately looking for a way out. But the wall of trees surrounding us was impenetrable. "There has to be a way to stop this," I shouted, dodging a grasping branch. "Sarah, please, this isn't justice, it's vengeance." For a moment, Sarah's expression wavered. "You know nothing of justice," she spat. "You cannot understand my suffering." An idea struck me then, born of desperation. I held up the diary. "But I do understand, Sarah. I've read your story. I know what they did to you, and it was wrong, so terribly wrong." Sarah's ghost drifted closer, her eyes fixed on the diary. "My words," she whispered. "My pain." I nodded, taking a cautious step forward. "Yes, and I want to help you, Sarah. We all do. But this isn't the way. You're becoming the very thing you hated, the very thing that destroyed you." Sarah's form flickered, uncertainty crossing her face. For a moment I thought I'd gotten through to her. But then her expression hardened once more. "Pretty words," she snarled. "But words cannot undo centuries of torment." With a wave of her hand, the ground beneath our feet began to shake. Fissures opened up, revealing a network of tunnels beneath the forest floor. "These catacombs run beneath the entire forest," Sarah said, her voice echoing ominously. "A fitting tomb for the descendants of my persecutors." As the ground continued to crumble, we found ourselves falling, tumbling into the darkness below. I heard my friends screaming, felt the rush of air around me, and then impact. Hard, but not as hard as I'd feared. We'd landed on some kind of underground slope, sliding deeper into the earth. When we finally came to a stop, we found ourselves in a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with crude stone shelves, each holding a human skull. "Where are we?" Tina asked, her voice trembling. I shone my flashlight around, revealing more and more skulls. "It's some kind of ossuary," I said. "A burial chamber." "Look!" Lisa pointed to a far corner of the chamber. There, partially obscured by shadows, stood a simple wooden coffin. The name carved into its lid made my heart skip a beat. Sarah Goodwin. "We found it," I breathed. We found Sarah's grave. But our triumph was short-lived. A cold wind whipped through the chamber, extinguishing our flashlights. In the darkness, I heard Sarah's voice, filled with fury and despair. "You think finding my earthly remains will save you? Fools! I've long since transcended the bonds of flesh and bone. This sacred ground will be your final resting place, as it was mine." The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones raining down from the ceiling. I could hear the others crying out in fear, but I couldn't see them in the pitch darkness. "Sarah, wait!" I called out, an idea forming. "You wanted us to understand your pain. Well, now we do. We're trapped, persecuted, just as you were. Is this what you really want? To become the very monster that destroyed you?" The shaking subsided slightly, and I pressed on. You were a victim, Sarah. But now you're making victims of others. Break the cycle, let go of your anger, find peace. For a long moment there was silence. Then, a soft, ethereal light began to fill the chamber. Sarah's ghost appeared before us, but she looked different now. Younger, softer, the anger gone from her eyes. Peace, she whispered, the word sounding foreign on her lips. I had forgotten what that felt like. I took a step towards her, my hand outstretched. It's not too late, Sarah. You can still choose a different path. Sarah looked at each of us in turn, centuries of pain and loneliness reflected in her eyes. Then slowly she nodded. Perhaps you are right, she said softly. Perhaps it is time to let go. As we watched in awe, Sarah's form began to fade, the light growing brighter and brighter until we had to shield our eyes. When it finally dimmed, Sarah was gone. The chamber was silent for a moment, then we heard a rumbling from above. But this time it wasn't threatening. A shaft of sunlight broke through the ceiling, illuminating a path back to the surface. As we made our way towards the light, exhausted but relieved, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? And what would we tell the world about what had happened here? But those were questions for later. For now, we climbed towards the sunlight, leaving the darkness of Sarah's tomb, and hopefully, her curse, behind us. The journey back to our campsite was a blur of exhaustion and relief. As we stumbled into the clearing, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the trees. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. I can't believe we made it, Lisa said, collapsing onto a fallen log. Big Mike nodded, his usual bravado subdued. Yeah, but what exactly did we make it through? I mean, was all of that real? I looked down at the diary in my hands, its leather cover now caked with dirt from our underground ordeal. It was real, I said softly. All of it. We spent the next hour in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts as we tried to process what we'd experienced. The possession, the chase through the forest, the underground tomb. It all seemed like a fever dream in the light of day. As the others busied themselves with rebuilding our camp, I retreated to my tent. I needed answers, and I knew the diary was the key to finding them. I pulled out my phone, grateful to see I had a signal again. Time to do some digging, I muttered to myself, opening my browser. Hours passed as I cross-referenced the diary's entries with historical records. The more I discovered, the colder I felt despite the warmth of the day outside. Guys, I called out, my voice shaking slightly. I think you need to see this. They gathered around as I spread out my findings, printouts from genealogy websites, historical records, and pages from the diary. What is all this, Jess? Sarah asked, peering at the papers. I took a deep breath. It's us. Our families. Our history. What do you mean? Tina leaned in closer. I mean, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, that we're all connected to this, to Sarah Goodwin, to what happened here centuries ago. A heavy silence fell over the group as the implications of my words sank in. Lisa was the first to speak. Connected how? I pointed to a family tree I'd pieced together. Sarah Goodwin was accused of witchcraft in 1692 by a man named Jonathan Proctor. Jonathan Proctor was my ancestor. The others gasped, but I wasn't finished. And it's not just me. Mike, your family name appears in the town records as part of the militia that hunted Sarah down. Lisa, one of your ancestors, was on the jury that condemned her. Sarah, Tina, your families were all there too, all involved in some way. That's impossible, Big Mike protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. I wish it was, but it's all here in black and white. We're all descendants of the people who wronged Sarah Goodwin. The revelation hit us like a physical blow. We'd thought we were random victims of a vengeful spirit, but the truth was far more complex and disturbing. So what does this mean? Tina asked, her voice trembling. Are we cursed or something? I ran a hand through my hair, frustration and fear warring inside me. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a cosmic coincidence that brought us all here. Some coincidence, Lisa muttered. As night began to fall once more, we huddled around the campfire, the warmth of the flames doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over us. We need to decide what we're going to do, I said, breaking the long silence. Sarah looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Do? What can we do? It's over, isn't it? Sarah's ghost is gone. I shook my head. Is it, though? We may have appeased her spirit for now, but what about the next time? What about all the other victims trapped in this forest? What are you suggesting? Big Mike asked, leaning forward. I took a deep breath. I think we have a responsibility. To Sarah, to her victims, to ourselves. We need to make this right. Make it right? Tina echoed. How? I pulled out the diary. By telling her story, the true story. Not the witch hunt narrative that's been passed down, but the real tale of an innocent woman, persecuted by ignorance and fear. Lisa nodded slowly. A kind of historical redemption. Exactly, I said, warming to the idea. We clear Sarah's name, bring to light the injustices she suffered. Maybe then, her spirit can truly rest. Big Mike stood up, pacing around the fire. That's all well and good, but how do we explain everything that's happened here? The possessions, the ghost sightings, the whatever the hell that was in the woods? It was a fair point. We'd experienced things that defied rational explanation, things that would be hard for anyone to believe. We tell the truth, I said simply. All of it. Let people make of it what they will. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Right, because that worked out so well for the original Sarah Goodwin. They'll think we're crazy. Maybe, I conceded. But it's better than staying silent, better than letting the lies of the past continue to hurt people. We debated long into the night, weighing the risks and responsibilities of what we'd learned. By the time the first light of dawn began to break, we'd reached a decision. So we're really doing this? Tina asked, looking around at our tired but determined faces. I nodded. We are. We'll start with the Historical Society, then move on to the media. We'll use the diary as evidence along with our own testimonies. And what about this place? Lisa gestured to the forest around us. Do we tell people to stay away? I considered for a moment. No, I think Sarah would want people to come here, to remember her, to learn from what happened. But we warn them. We make sure they know the true history of this place. As we began to pack up our camp for the final time, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Fear of what lay ahead, sorrow for what Sarah and her victims had endured, but also a sense of purpose. We had been brought here for a reason, bound together by threads of history and fate. Hey, Jess, Big Mike called out as we loaded the last of our gear into the cars. You really think this will make a difference? That people will believe us? I looked out at the forest, remembering all we'd seen and experienced. The terror, yes, but also the moments of revelation and understanding. I don't know, I admitted. But we have to try. For Sarah, for all of them. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was far from over. We had unraveled one mystery, but in doing so, we'd stumbled upon something much bigger. A story of injustice, redemption, and the long shadow cast by the sins of the past. The White Mountain National Forest receded in our rearview mirror, but I knew a part of it, and a part of Sarah, would always be with us. We had come seeking a simple camping trip and found instead a mission, a calling. The truth of Sarah Goodwin's story had been buried for centuries. Now it was up to us to bring it into the light. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, we owed her that much. As we hit the main road, I opened the diary one last time. On the final page, in fresh ink that seemed to shimmer in the morning light, a new entry had appeared. The wheel turns. The truth emerges. May you find the peace that eluded me. I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Our ordeal in the forest was over, but our real work was just beginning. And somehow I knew that Sarah would be with us every step of the way. The days following our return from the White Mountain National Forest were a blur of activity. We'd agreed to meet at my apartment in Boston to plan our next steps. As I paced around my living room, waiting for the others to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. A knock at the door made me jump. I opened it to find Lisa, her normally vibrant face drawn and pale. "You look how I feel," I said, stepping aside to let her in. She managed a weak smile. "Haven't been sleeping much. You?" I shook my head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the forest," she finished for me. "The faces in the trees." The others arrived soon after, each bearing the same haunted look. We gathered around my dining table, the diary sitting ominously at its center. "So," Big Mike said, breaking the tense silence, "what's the plan?" I took a deep breath. "We need to go public with Sarah's story, but we have to do it right. If we just start spouting off about ghosts and curses, no one will take us seriously." Sarah nodded. "We need evidence, historical records, expert opinions, anything that can corroborate the diary's contents." "I've been doing some digging," Tina chimed in, pulling out her laptop. "There are records of Sarah Goodwin's trial in the Salem archives. It's not much, but it's a start." As we discussed our strategy, a cold breeze swept through the room, despite the closed windows. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale with fear. "She's here," Lisa breathed. "Sarah's followed us." As if in response to Lisa's words, the diary on the table flew open, its pages flipping wildly. We all jumped back, chairs scraping against the floor. "Sarah?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is that you?" The pages stopped on a blank section near the back of the book. As we watched in stunned silence, words began to appear on the page, written by an invisible hand. "The truth must be told. But beware, for dark forces seek to keep it hidden." "Dark forces?" Big Mike read aloud. "What does that mean?" Before anyone could respond, a deep rumbling sound filled the apartment. The walls began to shake, picture frames rattling and books tumbling from shelves. "Everyone out!" I shouted, grabbing the diary and rushing for the door. We spilled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The shaking stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I looked down at the diary in my hands. I think it was a warning. We decided it wasn't safe to stay in the apartment. Gathering what supplies we could, we piled into Big Mike's SUV and headed out of the city. As the lights of Boston faded in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving towards something far more dangerous than what we were leaving behind. We ended up at a small motel just off the highway, gathering in my room to regroup. "Okay," I said, spreading out our research materials on the bed. "We need to figure out what Sarah meant by dark forces. Who would want to keep her story hidden?" Tina's fingers flew over her laptop keyboard. "I've been looking into the descendants of the people involved in Sarah's trial. Most of the families have died out or moved away, but there's one that still holds a lot of power in the area." She turned the screen towards us, showing a news article about a prominent New England family. "The Proctors," I read aloud, my blood running cold. "My family." Lisa put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Jess, this isn't your fault. You're not responsible for what your ancestors did." I nodded, but the weight of guilt was heavy on my shoulders. Maybe not, but I am responsible for making it right. As night fell, we took turns keeping watch, too wired and frightened to sleep. It was during my shift in the early hours of the morning that it happened. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The air seemed to thicken, and then, before my eyes, multiple spectral figures began to materialize. "Guys, wake up!" I shouted, backing away from the apparitions. The others jolted awake, their eyes widening in terror at the scene before them. The ghosts were clearer now, their features distinct. I recognized Sarah Goodwin, but the others were strangers to me. Men and women in colonial dress, their faces etched with pain and anger. Sarah's ghost stepped forward, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "The time has come. The final battle approaches." "Battle?" Big Mike asked, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "What battle?" Another ghost, a man with a stern face and piercing eyes, spoke up. "The battle for truth, for justice, for our very souls." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step forward. "Tell us what to do. How can we help?" Sarah's ghost smiled, a sad, ethereal expression. "Brave girl, you must return to the forest, to the heart of where it all began. There you will face the darkness that has kept us bound for centuries. But be warned," another ghost added. "The forces aligned against you are powerful. They will stop at nothing to keep the truth buried." As quickly as they had appeared, the ghosts began to fade. Sarah's was the last to go, her final words hanging in the air. "The cycle must be broken. The wheel must turn. We are counting on you." In the silence that followed their departure, we all looked at each other, the weight of our task settling heavily upon us. "So," Tina said, her voice small in the oppressive quiet, "I guess we're going back to the forest." I nodded, my resolve strengthening. "We are. But this time, we're going prepared." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. We gathered supplies, pored over maps of the White Mountain National Forest, and tried to prepare ourselves mentally for what lay ahead. As dawn broke, we stood in the motel parking lot, ready to embark on what felt like a final mission. "Everyone clear on the plan?" I asked, looking at each of my friends in turn. They nodded, their faces a mix of fear and determination. "Jess," Lisa said softly, "what if we don't all make it back?" I wish I could have reassured her, told her that everything would be fine. But after all we'd been through, false comfort seemed cruel. "Then we make sure our sacrifice means something," I said instead. "We make sure Sarah's story is told no matter what." As we piled into the SUV, I couldn't help but feel like we were soldiers heading into battle. In a way, I suppose we were. A battle against lies, against injustice, against the dark legacy of our own history. The diary sat heavy in my lap as we drove, its pages seeming to whisper with the voices of the dead. Whatever awaited us in the forest, I knew it would be unlike anything we'd faced before. "Here we go," Big Mike said as he turned onto the road leading into the White Mountain National Forest, into the belly of the beast. As the trees closed in around us, I sent up a silent prayer. Not for our safety, I knew that was far from guaranteed, but for the strength to see this through. To finally bring peace to Sarah Goodwin and all the other souls trapped in this cursed place. The final battle was about to begin, and one way or another, the truth would finally be set free. The forest loomed before us, a wall of ancient trees shrouded in mist. As we stepped out of the SUV, the air felt heavy with anticipation, as if the very land knew what was about to unfold. "Everyone remember the plan?" I asked, shouldering my backpack. The others nodded, their faces a mix of determination and fear. We had agreed to head straight for the heart of the forest, where we had encountered Sarah's ghost before. It seemed the most likely place for our final confrontation. As we set off down the overgrown trail, Big Mike took point, his imposing frame pushing aside low-hanging branches. "Stay close," he called back. "No wandering off this time." We had been walking for about an hour when Tina suddenly stopped, her head cocked to one side. "Do you guys hear that?" We all froze, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. But then, carried on the wind, came the faint sound of singing. "It's coming from over there." Lisa pointed off to our right, where the trees seemed to grow even denser. I hesitated, torn between following our original plan and investigating this new development, but something in my gut told me this was important. "Let's check it out," I said, "but stay together." We veered off the path, pushing through thick underbrush. The singing grew louder as we approached, a haunting melody in a language I didn't recognize. Suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. In its center stood a circle of standing stones, each taller than a person and covered in strange, swirling symbols. And there, in the middle of the circle, was a woman. She was elderly, with long white hair and skin as wrinkled as old parchment. Her eyes were closed as she sang, her arms raised to the sky. Excuse me?" I called out, not sure how else to announce our presence. The woman's eyes snapped open, fixing us with a piercing gaze. Her song cut off abruptly. "So," she said, her voice strong despite her apparent age, "you've come at last." We all exchanged confused glances. "You were expecting us?" Sarah asked. The old woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The spirits have been restless. They spoke of your coming, of the reckoning that approaches." A chill ran down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded. "I am Agatha," she replied, "last of the true witches of these woods." Big Mike scoffed. "Witches? Lady, I think you've been out in the sun too long." Agatha's eyes flashed dangerously. "Mock me at your peril, boy. You stand on the threshold of forces beyond your comprehension." I stepped forward, trying to diffuse the tension. "We're here about Sarah Goodwin. We want to set things right." At the mention of Sarah's name, Agatha's demeanor changed. Her face softened, a look of deep sadness passing over it. "Ah, poor Sarah," she murmured. "So much pain, so much anger. Her story has poisoned these woods for centuries." "You knew her?" Tina asked, her voice hushed with awe. Agatha nodded. "She was my apprentice many years ago, before the madness of the witch trials tore everything apart." As Agatha spoke, the air around us seemed to shimmer. Ghostly figures began to appear at the edge of the clearing, watching us with hollow eyes. "The veil between worlds grows thin," Agatha said, noticing our fearful glances. "The spirits gather for the final act of this long tragedy." "What do we need to do?" I asked, clutching Sarah's diary tightly. Agatha pointed to the center of the stone circle. "Place the diary there. It is the key to unraveling the curse that binds these souls." With shaking hands, I stepped into the circle and placed the diary on the ground. As soon as it touched the earth, a jolt of energy surged through the clearing. The ghostly figures drew closer, their forms becoming more solid. "Now," Agatha commanded, "you must confront the darkness, both within and without." Before I could ask what she meant, a cold wind whipped through the clearing. The ghosts began to wail, a sound of such anguish that it brought tears to my eyes. And then, emerging from the shadows between the trees, came a figure that made my blood run cold. It was a man dressed in the severe black clothes of a Puritan. His face was a mask of righteous fury. "Who dares disturb the judgment of God?" he boomed. Agatha's voice was grim. "Jonathan Proctor, the man who condemned Sarah Goodwin." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. This was my ancestor, the source of the guilt that had been gnawing at me since we discovered the truth. "You," Jonathan Proctor's ghost snarled, pointing at me. "Betrayer of your own blood. You would side with the witch?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stand tall. "I side with the truth. Sarah was innocent. You murdered her." Jonathan's form seemed to grow, looming over us. "Innocent? She consorted with the devil. She brought ruin upon our village." "No," came another voice, soft but firm. Sarah Goodwin's ghost appeared beside me, her eyes blazing with long-suppressed anger. "You brought ruin upon yourself, Jonathan. Your fear, your hatred, your refusal to see the world as it truly was." The two ghosts faced each other, centuries of pain and anger crackling between them like electricity. It's time to end this, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Time to let go of the past and move on. Jonathan's ghost turned to me, his face contorted with rage. You know nothing of the past, girl. You cannot undo what has been done. Maybe not. Lisa spoke up, stepping to my side. But we can learn from it. We can do better. One by one, my friends joined me in the circle. We stood together, facing down the specter of hatred and intolerance that had haunted these woods for so long. Agatha began to chant, her voice rising and falling in an otherworldly rhythm. The standing stones began to glow, pulsing with an inner light. The wheel turns, Agatha intoned. The truth emerges. Let the veil be lifted, the bonds broken, the spirit set free. A wind picked up, swirling around us with increasing intensity. The ghosts that had been watching from the sidelines were drawn into the vortex, their forms blurring and merging. Jonathan's ghost let out a howl of defiance, but he too began to fade. You cannot erase what was done, he cried. No, I shouted over the wind. But we can learn from it. We can grow. We can be better than those who came before us. Sarah's ghost smiled at me, a look of peace finally settling over her features. Thank you, she whispered, before she too was swept up in the whirlwind. The wind reached a fever pitch, and then suddenly everything went still. The clearing was empty save for us and Agatha. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest was gone, replaced by a sense of lightness and renewal. It is done, Agatha said, lowering her arms. The spirits have moved on. The curse is lifted. We all stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like we had just witnessed the turning of a great cosmic wheel, the righting of an ancient wrong. So, what now? Big Mike asked, breaking the silence. I walked to the center of the circle and picked up Sarah's diary. Its pages were blank now, as if the story it had contained had finally been told in full. Now, I said, looking at my friends, at Agatha, at the forest around us, we tell the world. We make sure Sarah's story is known. We make sure nothing like this ever happens again. As we made our way back through the forest, I couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had changed. Not just in the woods, but in us. We had faced the darkest parts of our history and come out the other side. The truth had been set free, and with it, so had we. The dense canopy of the Willamette National Forest loomed over us, a verdant ceiling that seemed to swallow the late afternoon sun. I pulled out my phone for what felt like the 100th time, squinting at the screen in vain hope. Any luck, Alex? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with a nervousness she was trying hard to mask. I shook my head, shoving the useless device back into my pocket. Still no signal. It's like we've walked off the edge of the world. Mike snorted, adjusting his heavy backpack. More like we've walked into the asshole of Oregon. Jake, I thought you said you knew these trails. Jake, our self-proclaimed expert hiker and de facto leader of this ill-fated expedition, was fiddling with his GPS unit. His usual cocky demeanor had given way to a furrowed brow and pursed lips. I do know them, he muttered, tapping the device with more force than necessary. Or at least I thought I did. Something's not right here. Lisa, always the peacemaker of our group, stepped between Mike and Jake. Come on, guys. Let's not point fingers. We're all in this together, right? I nodded, trying to inject some optimism into my voice. Lisa's right. We've still got a few hours of daylight left. We'll figure this out. But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. We'd set out early this morning for what was supposed to be a day hike, a chance to escape the confines of Portland and breathe in the crisp mountain air. Now, the forest that had seemed so inviting at dawn felt oppressive, almost malevolent. Jake's GPS chose that moment to let out a harsh beep. He stared at it, confusion etched across his face. What the hell? He muttered. Sarah peered over his shoulder. What is it? It's Glitching out or something, Jake replied, shaking the unit. 1 second it's showing us miles from where we should be. The next it's saying we're back at the trailhead. It's never done this before. Mike threw his hands up in exasperation. Great. Just great. So not only are we lost, but our only reliable piece of tech decides to crap out on us. Any other good news, fearless leader? I was about to intervene when I noticed the light changing. The sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us like grasping fingers. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Guys, I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. I think we need to make a decision. It'll be dark soon. The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. We all knew the stories of hikers who'd been caught unprepared after nightfall. The forest was unforgiving to the careless or unlucky. We should make camp, Lisa suggested, always the voice of reason. We've got supplies. In the morning we can try to retrace our steps. Jake shook his head vehemently. No way, we keep moving. I'm sure I can get us back to a marked trail if we just push on a little further. Are you insane? Mike exploded. We're already lost and you want to wander around in the dark? That's a great way to end up as bear food. There aren't any bears in this part of the forest, Jake shot back, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah, who'd been quietly scanning our surroundings, suddenly grabbed my arm. Did you hear that? She whispered. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the rustle of leaves and the faint call of birds settling in for the night. Then, just at the edge of perception, I caught it. A distant, eerie whistle. Probably just the wind, I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. That's not the wind, Lisa murmured, her eyes wide. The whistle came again, longer this time, with a cadence that was undeniably melodic. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Okay, that's it, Mike declared, his face pale in the fading light. I'm not sticking around to find out what's making that noise. We need to make camp now. For once, Jake didn't argue. We quickly found a small clearing and began setting up our tents with practiced efficiency born from countless camping trips. But this was different. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. As I hammered in the last stake for my tent, I happened to glance up. Through a gap in the trees, I swore I saw a flicker of light in the distance. It was gone in an instant, so quick I might have imagined it. Hey, I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Did anyone else see that? The others gathered around me, following my gaze into the deepening gloom of the forest. See what? Sarah asked, clutching her jacket tightly around her. I was about to explain when the whistle came again, closer this time. We all jumped, instinctively huddling together. What the hell is going on? Jake muttered, all his earlier bravado evaporated. Lisa gripped my hand tightly. Alex, I'm scared, she admitted, her voice trembling. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be all right. But as the shadows lengthened and that unearthly whistle echoed through the darkening forest, I knew I'd be lying. Something was out there. Something that didn't want us here. Let's just try to get some sleep, I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. We'll figure this out in the morning. We mumbled our good nights and retreated to our tents. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, every sense on high alert, I knew sleep would be a long time coming. The forest had changed with the setting of the sun, transformed into a realm of shadows and secrets. And somewhere out there, beyond the thin fabric of our tents, something was waiting, watching. I closed my eyes, praying for dawn, but the whistle came again, closer now, a haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing and things best left forgotten. Welcome to Whisper Creek, a voice seemed to say in my mind. Welcome home. The long night had only just begun. Dawn broke with a sickly pale light that did little to dispel the shadows clinging to the forest floor. None of us had slept well, our dreams haunted by that eerie whistle and flashes of movement just beyond our vision. We packed up camp in silence, the weight of unspoken fears hanging heavy in the air. So, what's the plan? Mike finally asked, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine concern. Jake, looking haggard and uncertain, shrugged. I guess we keep moving. Try to find our way back to a marked trail. And if we don't? Sarah pressed, voicing the question we were all afraid to ask. Before Jake could respond, Lisa let out a gasp. Guys, look! We followed her gaze and collectively froze. Through a break in the trees we could see a clearing. And in that clearing... Is that a town? I whispered, hardly daring to believe my eyes. We stumbled forward, drawn by the promise of civilization. As we entered the clearing, the full view of what lay before us stole our breath away. It was indeed a town, or what remained of one. Decrepit buildings lined what must have once been a main street, their windows dark and empty, like the eye sockets of a skull. This is impossible, Jake muttered, pulling out his useless GPS. There's no town marked anywhere near here. Sarah stepped forward, her face a mix of wonder and apprehension. It looks like it's been abandoned for years. As we moved further into the town, the sense of wrongness grew. Cars from the 1950s sat rusting along the curb, frozen in time. Storefronts advertised products long out of production. It was as if we'd stepped through a portal into the past. Welcome to Whisper Creek, Mike read aloud from a rusted sign at the town's entrance. The moment the words left his lips, a chill ran down my spine. Whisper Creek. The name from my dreams. Does anyone else feel like we're being watched? Lisa asked, hugging herself tightly. I nodded, unable to shake the sensation of unseen eyes following our every move. Let's check out some of these buildings. Maybe we can find a working phone or something. We split up, agreeing to meet back in the town square in an hour. Sarah and I headed towards what looked like it had once been a general store. The bell above the door let out a mournful jingle as we entered, stirring up clouds of dust. Alex, Sarah called from behind the counter. You need to see this. She held up a yellowed newspaper, its edges crumbling at her touch. The date at the top read, July 15th, 1952. But it was the headline that made my blood run cold. Mysterious illness continues to plague Whisper Creek. What the hell happened here? I wondered aloud, scanning the article. It spoke of a rapidly spreading sickness, of quarantines and failed treatments. And at the end, a chilling quote from the town doctor. It's as if the very soul of our town is being consumed. A sudden crash from outside made us both jump. We rushed to the window, but the street remained empty. We should find the others, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. As we stepped back onto the street, the sun was already dipping towards the horizon. Impossible. We couldn't have been in the store for more than 20 minutes. We found Mike and Jake in the town square, both looking shaken. This place is wrong, Mike said without preamble. The clocks in the hardware store, they're all stopped at 3:33. Every single one of them. Jake nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by a look of dread. And the calendars in the post office, they're all open to July 1952, the same month as that newspaper you found. A thought struck me. Where's Lisa? The others looked around, realization dawning on their faces. Lisa was nowhere to be seen. Lisa, I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally in the empty town. No response. She probably just lost track of time exploring, Sarah said, but her tone betrayed her lack of conviction. As if in response to our growing panic, the sun suddenly plummeted below the horizon, plunging the town into darkness with unnatural speed. Street lamps flickered to life, casting pools of sickly yellow light that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. We need to find shelter, Jake said, taking charge once again. We can look for Lisa in the morning. Are you insane? I shot back. We can't leave her out here alone. But even as I protested, I knew he was right. The darkness between the buildings seemed to writhe and shift, and that damned whistle was back, closer than ever. The church, Sarah suggested, pointing to a steeple that loomed over the other buildings. It's the biggest building in town. If Lisa is looking for us, she might go there. We made our way through the darkened streets, our footsteps echoing far too loudly in the oppressive silence. The church doors creaked open at our touch, as if welcoming us in. The interior was a study in decay. Pews lay toppled and rotting, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But it was the altar that drew our attention. Dozens of candles burned there, their flames steady despite the draft from the open door. "Okay, someone want to explain that?" Mike asked, his voice higher than usual. "Because I'm pretty sure candles don't burn for 70 years. Before anyone could respond, a child's laughter echoed through the church. We spun around, but the nave behind us was empty. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. "By the door, I swear I saw a little girl." But the doorway was empty, the street beyond dark and still. "We need to barricade the door," Jake said, already moving to push a heavy pew across the entrance. "Whatever's out there, I don't want it getting in here." We worked quickly, piling anything we could find against the doors and windows. When we finally finished, we gathered near the altar, the candle's warm light doing little to dispel the chill that had settled into our bones. "What's happening to us?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. I wished I had an answer for her. Instead, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the dusty floor. "We should try to get some sleep. Maybe things will make more sense in the morning." But as I lay there, listening to the others toss and turn, I knew sleep would be a long time coming. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind outside sounded like footsteps, like whispered voices just on the edge of comprehension. I must have dozed off eventually, because suddenly I was awake, heart pounding. Something had woken me, but what? Then I heard it, a scratching sound coming from inside the walls. Scratch, 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 like bony fingers clawing their way through the wood. "Guys," I whispered, sitting up. "Do you hear that?" The others stirred, and I saw the moment awareness hit them, their eyes widening in the candlelight. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then, carried on a draft that shouldn't have been possible in our barricaded sanctuary, came a whisper. "Join us, join us, join us." Sarah let out a muffled scream, burying her face in her sleeping bag. Mike cursed, scrambling backwards until his back hit the altar. Jake just sat there, frozen, his face a mask of terror. And me? I found myself standing, drawn towards the source of the scratching, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Because in that whisper, beneath the otherworldly chill, I'd heard something familiar. A voice I recognized. "Lisa," I called out, my own voice sounding strange to my ears. "Lisa, is that you?" The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, so quietly I might have imagined it, came a response. "Alex, help me." As dawn broke over Whisper Creek, painting the abandoned town in shades of gray, 4 terrified friends huddled in a desecrated church, while somewhere in the walls something that might once have been their friend scratched and whispered, beckoning them to join the town's long-dead residents in whatever hell they'd found themselves trapped in. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the past never dies, and neither do you. The pale light of dawn did little to ease our fears. We'd spent the night huddled together in the church, jumping at every creak and whisper. The scratching in the walls had eventually subsided, but the memory of it, and of Lisa's voice, lingered like a bad taste. I was the first to stir, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The others were still dozing fitfully, their faces drawn and pale even in repose. I stood, stretching muscles stiff from tension, and made my way to one of the windows we'd barricaded the night before. Carefully, I shifted aside a piece of broken pew and peered out. The street beyond was empty, bathed in a gray light that seemed to leach the color from everything it touched. But something was different. I blinked, trying to figure out what had changed. The crosses, every gravestone in the small cemetery beside the church had been inverted. "What the hell?" I muttered, rubbing my eyes. But the impossible sight remained. A hand on my shoulder made me jump. It was Sarah, her eyes wide with concern. "Alex?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I gestured wordlessly at the window. Sarah looked, then quickly stumbled back, her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. The commotion roused Mike and Jake. They joined us at the window, and I watched the color drain from their faces as they took in the scene. "Okay," Mike said, his voice shaky. "I'm officially freaked out now. This isn't just some abandoned town. This is something else." Jake nodded, for once at a loss for words. Then a sound broke the eerie silence, children's laughter drifting in from the street. We all froze, exchanging looks of disbelief and terror. Slowly we turned back to the window. The street was no longer empty. A group of children, maybe 5 or 6 of them, were playing some kind of game in front of the church. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a 1950s movie. And their skin, it was too pale, almost translucent in the weak morning light. "This isn't real," Sarah whispered, backing away from the window. "It can't be real." But even as she spoke, one of the children, a little girl in a blue dress, turned and looked directly at us. Her eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. She smiled, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp, and waved. I jerked back from the window, my heart pounding. "We need to get out of here, now." No one argued. We grabbed our packs and began dismantling the barricade we'd built the night before. The laughter outside had stopped, replaced by an expectant silence that was somehow worse. As Jake pulled open the heavy church doors, we all held our breath. But the street beyond was empty once more. No sign of the spectral children we'd seen moments before. "Maybe we imagined it," Mike said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it for a second. We made our way down the church steps, our eyes darting in every direction, half expecting something to leap out at us from the shadows. But nothing did. The town remained still and silent around us. "We need to find Lisa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then we get the hell out of this place." The others nodded in agreement. We decided to start with the buildings we hadn't explored the day before, hoping against hope that Lisa had simply gotten lost or trapped somewhere. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The empty windows of the buildings seemed to follow our progress, and more than once I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look. We'd been searching for about an hour when Mike suddenly stopped in his tracks, his face pale. "Guys," he said, his voice trembling. I think I saw something in my sleeping bag last night." We all turned to him, a chill running down my spine at his words. "What do you mean you saw something?" Jake asked, his earlier skepticism long gone. Mike swallowed hard. "I woke up in the middle of the night. There was a figure standing at the foot of my sleeping bag, just watching me." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I thought I was dreaming," Mike replied, running a shaky hand through his hair. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, it was gone. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. But now, after what we saw this morning, we all fell silent, the implications of Mike's story hanging heavy in the air. If what he'd seen was real, then we weren't alone in that church last night, and whatever was in there with us, it wasn't Lisa. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. "We still need to find Lisa." We continued our search, but with a new urgency and a heightened sense of dread. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every unexpected sound made us jump. It was Jake who made the next disturbing discovery. We were passing by what looked like it had once been a small electronics store when he suddenly stopped, fishing his phone out of his pocket. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping at the screen. "What is it?" Sarah asked, peering over his shoulder. Jake held up his phone, showing us the blank screen. "It's dead. But I swear it was fully charged when we left Portland." A chill ran through me as I remembered my own phone. I pulled it out, only to find it completely unresponsive as well. "Mine too," I said, a sinking feeling in my stomach. Sarah and Mike checked their phones only to find the same result. All of our devices, which had been working fine just yesterday, were now completely dead. "This is impossible," Mike muttered, shaking his phone as if that might somehow bring it back to life. They can't all have died at the same time. But they had. And suddenly, our tenuous connection to the outside world, our hope of calling for help, was gone. As the reality of our situation sank in, a new sound reached our ears. A low, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the walls of the building next to us. It was the same sound we'd heard in the church, but louder now, more insistent. We backed away from the building, huddling together in the middle of the street. The scratching grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. And then, carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the still air, came the whispers. "Join us. Join us. Join us." Sarah let out a choked sob, clinging to my arm. Mike had gone pale, his eyes darting from building to building as if expecting something to burst through the walls at any moment. Even Jake, our self-appointed leader, looked lost and scared. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The whispers faded away, leaving us in a silence so profound it seemed to press against our eardrums. For a long moment, none of us moved or spoke. Then, slowly, we turned to look at each other, the same question reflected in all of our eyes. What do we do now? We were trapped in a town that shouldn't exist, surrounded by horrors we couldn't explain. Our technology was useless, our friend was missing, and with every passing moment, the line between reality and nightmare seemed to blur a little more. As we stood there, lost and afraid in the empty street of Whisper Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Whatever had happened to this town, whatever had taken Lisa, it was coming for us next. And in the back of my mind, a traitorous little voice whispered a terrible truth. Maybe joining them was the only way out. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the past is always present, and the future. Well, the future might just be more terrifying than we could ever imagine. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, but its light seemed unable to penetrate the oppressive gloom that hung over Whisper Creek. We'd been wandering the streets for hours, calling Lisa's name until our voices were hoarse, but to no avail. The town remained silent, save for the occasional whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We need a plan," Jake said, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. "We can't just keep wandering around aimlessly." Sarah nodded, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Maybe we should check out the town hall. If there are any records left, they might tell us what happened here." It was as good an idea as any. We made our way down the main street, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. The town hall was an imposing Victorian structure, its white paint peeling and windows dark with decades of grime. As we approached, I noticed something odd about the building next door. It was smaller, more modest, but there was a faded red cross painted above the door. "Guys, look," I said, pointing. "I think that's the old doctor's office." Mike frowned. Wasn't there something in that newspaper about a doctor? And a plague? A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the headline. "You're right. Maybe we should check it out. There might be some clues about what happened here." We approached the building cautiously. The door creaked open at my touch as if welcoming us in. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with outdated medical equipment that looked more like instruments of torture. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. Jake had made his way to an old desk in the corner. "Guys, come look at this." We gathered around. He was holding a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. As he opened it, a cloud of dust rose, making us all cough. "It's the doctor's journal," Jake said, squinting at the faded handwriting. "Listen to this. July 10th, 1952. 3 more cases today. The symptoms are progressing faster now. Fever, delirium, and then they start hearing the whispers." We all exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah's hand unconsciously went to her throat. "Keep reading," Mike urged, his face pale. Jake flipped through a few more pages. "Here's another entry. July 15th, 1952. God help us all. The quarantine has failed. Half the town is infected now. Those who aren't sick swear they can hear scratching in the walls at night. And the whispers are getting louder. A sudden crash from upstairs made us all jump. Sarah let out a small scream. "What was that?" she whispered, clutching my arm. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. Scratch, 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 coming from inside the walls. "We need to get out of here," I said, my heart pounding. "Now." We turned to leave, but Sarah suddenly doubled over, coughing violently. "Sarah?" I said, reaching for her. "Are you okay?" She straightened up, her face pale. "I'm fine, just dust, I think." But as she lowered her hand, I caught a glimpse of something on her wrist. A rash, angry and red, spreading up her arm. "Oh God," Mike breathed, seeing it too. "That looks just like the symptoms described in the journal," Jake finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes widened in panic. No, it can't be. It's just an allergy or something. It has to be." But even as she spoke, I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew, as we all did, that this was no ordinary rash. A commotion outside drew our attention. We rushed to the window, peering out into the street. What we saw made my blood run cold. Shadowy figures were darting between the buildings, moving with an unnatural speed and grace. They seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a badly tuned TV signal. "What the hell are those things?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, one of the figures stopped in the middle of the street. Slowly, it turned its head towards us. Even from this distance, I could see that where its eyes should have been, there were only empty black sockets. It smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and then it was gone, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. We stumbled back from the window, our hearts racing. "We need to get out of this town," Jake said, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Now." No one argued. We grabbed Sarah, who was still staring at the rash on her arm in horror, and made for the door. But as we stepped outside, we realized our predicament had only worsened. A thick, unnatural fog had rolled in, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The buildings loomed out of the mist like the ghosts of themselves, their edges blurred and indistinct. "Which way?" Mike asked, spinning around in confusion. "This way," I said, pointing down what I hoped was the street leading out of town. "Come on." We ran, the fog swirling around our feet. Sarah's increasingly labored breathing the only sound beyond our pounding footsteps. I could feel the wrongness of this place pressing in on us, as if the very air was trying to infect us with its malevolence. Suddenly, Mike skidded to a halt. "Wait, where's my backpack?" We all stopped, looking around in confusion. In our panic to leave the doctor's office, Mike must have left his pack behind. "We have to go back for it," he insisted. "All my supplies are in there." Jake shook his head vehemently. "Are you insane? We can't go back there." But Mike was already turning, disappearing into the fog before we could stop him. "Mike!" I called out. "Mike, come back!" But there was no response. The fog had swallowed him completely. We stood there, uncertain, the tendrils of mist curling around us like grasping fingers. Sarah's coughing had gotten worse, and I could see the rash had spread further up her arm. "We can't leave him," I said finally. "I'll go back and look for him. You two keep going. Try to find a way out of town." Jake nodded, putting an arm around Sarah to support her. "Be careful, Alex, and if you can't find him quickly, just get out of there, okay?" I nodded, trying to ignore the fear churning in my gut. As I watched Jake and Sarah disappear into the fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might never see them again. Taking a deep breath, I turned and headed back towards the doctor's office. The fog seemed to part before me, guiding my way with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. As I approached the building, I saw something that made my heart stop. Mike's backpack was lying in the middle of the street, torn to shreds as if by some savage animal. "Mike?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Mike, are you here?" But the only response was the ever-present whisper growing louder now. "Join us. Join us. Join us." As I stood there, alone in the fog-shrouded street of Whisper Creek, I realized with a sinking heart that we might already be too late. Whatever malevolent force held this town in its grip, it had Mike now. And if we didn't find a way out soon, it would have us all. The whispers grew louder, and in the swirling mist I could almost see faces forming, their mouths moving in silent screams. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the past is a predator, and the future, well, the future might just be more terrifying than we could ever imagine. The fog swirled around me, thick and oppressive, as I stumbled back towards where I'd last seen Jake and Sarah. Mike's shredded backpack weighed heavily in my hands, a grim reminder of what we were up against. "Jake, Sarah!" I called out, my voice sounding muffled in the dense mist. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Sarah's labored cough. Following the sound, I found them huddled against the wall of a dilapidated building. Jake's eyes widened as he saw me. "Alex, thank God, but where's Mike?" I held up the tattered remains of the backpack, my throat tight. "I found this in the street. There was no sign of him." Sarah let out a choked sob, her face pale and drawn. The rash had spread further, angry red tendrils now creeping up her neck. "We can't stay here," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We need to find a way out of this town." Jake nodded, helping Sarah to her feet. I think I saw something when the fog cleared for a moment. Looked like some kind of track leading into the woods. It was as good a lead as any. We made our way through the ghostly town, the fog parting just enough to show us the way, as if it were guiding us toward some predetermined destination. At the edge of town, we found what Jake had seen, an old, overgrown trail leading into the dense forest. Beside it stood a weathered sign, "Whisper Creek Mine, 1 mile." "A mine?" Sarah rasped, her voice weak. "Maybe there's another way out through there." I nodded, though a sense of foreboding settled in my gut. "It's worth a shot. At least it'll get us out of this fog." We started down the trail, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. As we walked, the whispers that had plagued us in town grew louder, more insistent. "Do you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. I nodded grimly. "It's getting clearer, almost like voices." And they were. As we delved deeper into the forest, the whispers began to form words, snippets of conversation that echoed around us. The infection spreads. Can't escape the darkness. Join us in eternity. Sarah stumbled, nearly falling. As Jake and I caught her, I noticed her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Sarah," I said, shaking her gently. "Stay with us, okay?" She blinked, seeming to come back to herself. I can hear them, Alex. They're calling to me." Before I could respond, the trees suddenly parted, revealing the yawning mouth of the mine. The entrance was a black void, seeming to swallow all light. Jake pulled out a flashlight, its beam barely penetrating the darkness. "I guess we go in?" Taking a deep breath, we stepped into the mine. The temperature dropped immediately, our breath fogging in the cold air. The walls were slick with moisture, and the ground beneath our feet was treacherously uneven. As we ventured deeper, Jake's flashlight beam caught something on the wall. We moved closer, and I felt my blood run cold. Cave paintings covered the rock face, but these were like nothing I'd ever seen before. They depicted grotesque figures, their bodies twisted and deformed, and in the center of it all, a massive, dark shape with too many eyes and grasping tentacles. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice echoing in the tunnel. Before I could answer, Sarah let out a strangled gasp. "It's moving." And it was. As we watched in horror, the figures in the painting began to writhe and shift, as if trying to break free from the rock itself. "This isn't possible," I muttered, backing away. But in Whisper Creek, the impossible seemed to be the norm. We pressed on, trying to ignore the way the painted figures seemed to follow us with their eyes. The tunnel sloped downward, taking us deeper into the earth. Suddenly, Jake's foot caught on something, and he pitched forward with a yell. Sarah and I grabbed for him, but too late. He disappeared into a dark opening we hadn't seen. "Jake!" I shouted, shining the flashlight into the hole. It illuminated a steep shaft, disappearing into darkness. For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then, faintly, we heard Jake's voice. "I'm okay, it's not too deep. There's something down here, you need to see this." Sarah and I exchanged glances. "We're coming down," I called back. Carefully, we made our way down the shaft. At the bottom, we found Jake standing in a large cavern, his flashlight beam dancing over the walls. "Look," he said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and terror. The cavern walls were covered in more paintings, but these were different. They told a story, the story of Whisper Creek. We saw images of the town in its heyday, of smiling families and prosperous businesses. Then came darker images, people falling ill, buildings being boarded up, and always in the background, that same dark, many-eyed shape from the earlier painting. "It's the plague," Sarah whispered, her voice weak. "It's showing us how it all began." As we watched, the images began to move again, faster now. We saw people transforming, their bodies twisting into inhuman shapes. We saw them scratching at walls, whispering to the living, luring them into the darkness. And then, to our horror, we saw ourselves. Our arrival in town, our exploration of the abandoned buildings, our descent into the mine. The paintings were creating our story, even as we lived it. Jake stumbled back, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, now." But as we turned to leave, we found our way blocked. The shaft we'd climbed down had vanished, replaced by smooth, unbroken rock. "No," I muttered, running my hands over the wall. "No, no, no." Sarah sank to her knees, coughing violently. When she looked up, her eyes were black, empty voids. "Can you hear them?" she asked, her voice no longer her own. "They're calling us home." Jake and I backed away, our hearts pounding. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, seeming to come from the very rock around us. "Join us. Join us. Join us." As we stood there, trapped in the bowels of the earth, I realized with a sinking heart that we had walked willingly into the belly of the beast. Whisper Creek had led us here, to this cavern deep beneath the town, where the line between past and present, between life and death, blurred into meaninglessness. The paintings on the walls continued to shift and change, showing us glimpses of a future too horrifying to contemplate. And as Sarah's eyes rolled back in her head, her body beginning to twitch and transform, I knew that our story was far from over. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the earth itself holds ancient secrets and the darkness, well, the darkness might just be the least of our worries. The cavern walls seemed to close in around us as Sarah's body contorted, her skin taking on a sickly, translucent quality. Jake and I stood frozen, caught between the horror of Sarah's transformation and the impossible moving images on the cave walls. "We have to do something," Jake shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I nodded, forcing myself into action. Sarah, can you hear me?" Her head snapped towards us, those black, empty eyes fixing on mine. When she spoke, her voice was a rasping whisper that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "Why fight it, Alex? Don't you see? This is where we belong. Where we've always belonged." A chill ran down my spine. "That's not Sarah talking," I muttered to Jake. "Whatever's infected this town, it's got her now." Jake's face hardened with determination. "Then we'll just have to snap her out of it." He stepped forward, reaching for Sarah, but I pulled him back just as her arm lashed out, fingernails elongated into wicked claws. "Careful," I warned. "I don't think that's our Sarah anymore." As if in response to my words, Sarah's body began to twist and stretch in ways that defied anatomy. Her joints popped and cracked, limbs bending at impossible angles. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him towards the only exit we could see, a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the mine. We sprinted down the passageway, the sound of Sarah's inhuman shrieks echoing behind us. The beam of Jake's flashlight bounced wildly off the walls, creating a dizzying strobe effect. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into another cavern, this one vast and dimly lit by an eerie, phosphorescent glow emanating from the walls. In the center stood a collection of strange, angular machines, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. "What the hell is this place?" Jake panted, his eyes wide as he took in our surroundings. Before I could respond, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "Alex? Jake? Is that you?" We spun around to see Mike emerging from behind one of the machines, his face pale and drawn. "Mike!" I exclaimed, relief washing over me. "You're alive. How did you get here?" He shook his head, confusion clear in his eyes. "I don't know. One minute I was in the street going back for my backpack. The next, I was here. But guys, something's wrong with time in this place." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Mike held up his wrist, showing us his watch. The hands were spinning wildly, sometimes clockwise, sometimes counterclockwise. "It hasn't stopped doing this since I got here, and look at this." He led us to one of the machines, wiping away the dust to reveal a control panel. The date displayed on it read, July 15th, 1952. "That's the date from the newspaper," I whispered. "The day the plague hit its peak." Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the cavern. Sarah, or what used to be Sarah, had found us. "Quick, hide," Jake hissed, pulling us behind one of the larger machines. We crouched in the shadows, hardly daring to breathe as the thing that had been our friend stalked into the room. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, its head swiveling as it searched for us. As we watched in horror, Sarah's form seemed to flicker and change. One moment she was as we had last seen her, twisted and monstrous. The next she was as she had been when we first entered Whisper Creek, whole and human. The transitions happened in the blink of an eye, as if two realities were superimposed on each other. "Time isn't just broken here," Mike whispered. "It's shattered." As if to prove his point, I noticed something strange happening to our surroundings. The dust on the machines began to disappear, the metal surfaces gleaming as if brand new. The phosphorescent glow brightened, and suddenly the cavern was filled with people. Scientists in lab coats, military personnel, all moving about with purpose. "What's happening?" Jake gasped. "We're seeing the past," I realized. "This is Whisper Creek as it was in 1952. We watched, transfixed, as the scene played out before us. The scientists huddled around the machines, their faces a mix of excitement and fear. One of them, a tall man with thick glasses, approached a central console. "Initiating the temporal fold now," he announced, his voice somehow clear despite the decades separating us. As he pulled a lever, a low hum filled the air. The machines came to life, lights flashing and gears grinding. In the center of the room, the air itself seemed to ripple and tear. "My God," one of the other scientists breathed. "It's working. We've opened a gateway to—" His words were cut off by a sudden, deafening roar. The tear in the air widened, and through it, we caught a glimpse of something so horrifying, so alien, that my mind recoiled from the sight. Tentacles, eyes, mouths, all wrong, all impossible, began to force their way through the rift. The scientists screamed, trying to shut down the machines, but it was too late. As suddenly as it had appeared, the vision vanished. We were back in the dusty, abandoned cavern, alone except for the twisted thing that had once been Sarah. "They did this," Mike said, his voice shaking. "They opened a door to somewhere they shouldn't have and let something through." Jake nodded grimly. "The plague. It wasn't a disease, it was an invasion." The realization hit me like a physical blow. And now we're caught in the aftermath, trapped in a town where time itself has been fractured. A low chuckle made us all freeze. Sarah, or the thing wearing Sarah's form, was standing right in front of our hiding place. "Smart little rats, aren't you?" it said, its voice a horrifying blend of Sarah's and something utterly inhuman. But knowing the truth won't save you. Nothing can save you now. It lunged forward, claws extended. We scattered, diving in different directions. I found myself next to the central console, the same one the scientist had used in our vision of the past. Without thinking, I grabbed the lever and pulled. The machines roared to life, lights flashing and gears grinding just as they had in the vision. The air in the center of the room began to ripple and tear. "Alex, what are you doing?" Jake shouted over the noise. "I don't know," I yelled back, "but it's our only chance." The thing that had been Sarah shrieked, a sound of equal parts rage and fear. It lunged for me, but Mike tackled it from behind, sending them both sprawling. "Go," Mike shouted. "I'll hold it off." Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the widening rift in the air. "We can't leave him." But even as he spoke, I saw Mike's eyes begin to darken, his skin taking on the same sickly translucence as Sarah's. The infection was spreading. "We have to go," I said, my heart breaking, "or we'll all be lost." With a final look at our friends, one lost to the horrors of Whisper Creek, one in the process of joining them, Jake and I leapt into the rift. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of images and sensations. I saw Whisper Creek as it had been, as it was, as it might be. I saw versions of ourselves living and dying in countless iterations of the town's endless recursive nightmare. And through it all, I heard the whispers, growing louder and more insistent. "Join us. Join us. Join us." As Jake and I tumbled through the fractured timescape of Whisper Creek, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. We had escaped the immediate danger, but we were now lost in the twisted heart of whatever cosmic horror had engulfed this town. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where time is a broken mirror and reality, well, reality might just be the most terrifying illusion of all. The world snapped back into focus with jarring suddenness. Jake and I found ourselves sprawled on the cracked pavement of Whisper Creek's main street, gasping for air as if we'd just been underwater. The fog that had engulfed the town earlier was gone, replaced by an eerie, unnatural clarity. "Are we back?" Jake croaked, pushing himself to his feet. I stood up slowly, my head spinning. "I think so. But when are we?" The town looked different somehow. The buildings were still dilapidated, but they seemed fresher, as if they'd been abandoned more recently. Before we could ponder this further, a sound split the air that made our blood run cold. Bong, bong, bong. The church bell, silent since our arrival, was tolling. "That's impossible," Jake whispered, his face pale. That bell tower was falling apart when we saw it. Yet the sound continued, echoing through the empty streets. With each resonant tone, I felt a vibration in my chest, as if the bell were calling to something deep inside me. "We need to get out of sight," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. "I've got a bad feeling about this." We ducked into the nearest building, which turned out to be the old sheriff's office. As we barricaded the door behind us, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Through the grimy window, I saw shapes emerging from the buildings lining the street. "Jake," I hissed. "Look." He joined me at the window, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. Dozens of figures were shuffling out onto the street, moving with the jerky, unnatural gait we'd seen in Sarah. But these weren't the twisted monstrosities we'd fled in the mine. These looked human, or at least they had once. "Are they ghosts?" Jake whispered. I shook my head slowly. "I don't think so. I think they're echoes, remnants of the town's past, caught in this time slip." We watched in horrified fascination as the spectral procession made its way down the street, heading towards the church. Men, women, children, all with the same vacant, black-eyed stare we'd seen in Sarah. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, a new sound caught my attention. Footsteps coming from deeper within the building. We weren't alone. "Quick," I whispered. "In here." We ducked into what looked like an old jail cell, pressing ourselves against the wall. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure passed by our hiding spot. It was a man in an old-fashioned sheriff's uniform, his movements stiff and jerky. As he passed, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were normal, not the black voids we'd seen in the others, but they were unfocused, unseeing. He was moving like a sleepwalker, heading towards the exit. "He's joining the procession," Jake realized. I nodded grimly. "Whatever's happening, it's affecting everyone who was in the town when it happened." We waited until the sheriff had left before emerging from our hiding spot. Jake immediately went to the desk, rifling through the papers scattered across its surface. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Looking for answers," he replied. If anyone knew what was really going on in this town, it would have been the sheriff. As Jake searched, I noticed something odd about the cell we'd hidden in. The mirror on the wall was covered in a thick layer of grime, but underneath I could see something scratched into the glass. I wiped away the dirt, revealing a series of numbers and symbols etched into the mirror's surface. "Jake, look at this." He joined me, frowning at the strange markings. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know, but..." I broke off as I caught sight of our reflections in the cleared part of the mirror. Or rather, what should have been our reflections. The faces looking back at us were blurred, indistinct, as if we were fading away. "Oh God," Jake breathed. "What's happening to us?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep the panic at bay. I think we're being erased. The longer we stay here, the more we become part of whatever this is." A sudden chill filled the air, and I saw Jake's breath mist in front of him. "Did it just get colder in here?" I nodded, rubbing my arms. "Much colder. Almost like..." My words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream from outside. We rushed to the window, peering out onto the street. The spectral procession had stopped, and all the figures were looking up at the sky. Following their gaze, I felt my heart stop. The sky was changing. The blue was draining away, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness. And in that darkness I could see things. Shapes that hurt my eyes to look at, tentacles and mouths and too many eyes. "It's happening again," I whispered. "Whatever came through in 1952, it's coming back." Jake grabbed my arm, his face a mask of terror. "We have to get out of here, now." We turned to leave, but found our path blocked. The spectral sheriff was standing in the doorway, his eyes now black and empty. "Join us," he rasped, his voice a chorus of whispers. "Join us in eternity." Jake and I backed away, looking frantically for another exit. But the room seemed to be shrinking, the walls closing in. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on every surface. And then, in the mirror behind us, a face appeared. Not our fading reflections, but a woman's face, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. Her mouth moved, forming words we couldn't hear. "What's she saying?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I squinted, trying to read her lips. I think she's saying, "The bell. Stop the bell." The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us alone with the advancing sheriff in the increasingly claustrophobic room. "The bell," Jake repeated. "Alex, we have to get to the church. It's the center of all this." I nodded, my mind racing. But how do we get past him? As if in answer, the sheriff lunged forward, his hands grasping for us. We dodged, ducking under his arms and making a break for the door. Behind us, I heard him crash into the desk, but I didn't dare look back. We burst out onto the street, immediately assaulted by the bitter cold and the otherworldly screech coming from the vortex above. The spectral figures were all around us now, reaching for us with grasping hands as we pushed through their midst. "The church!" I yelled over the cacophony. "We have to get to the church." We ran, our feet pounding on the cracked pavement. The world around us seemed to be unraveling, buildings flickering in and out of existence, the street itself rippling like water. As we neared the church, the bell's toll grew louder. each bong sending a shockwave of force that nearly knocked us off our feet. The doors loomed before us, impossibly large and ornate. With the last of our strength, Jake and I threw ourselves against them. For a moment, I thought they wouldn't budge, that we'd be trapped outside as reality collapsed around us. Then, with a groan of ancient wood, the doors swung open. We tumbled inside, slamming them shut behind us. The interior of the church was a maelstrom of swirling energy, centered around the bell tower. Each toll of the bell sent out a pulse of sickly green light, and I could see something forming in the air, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. "We have to stop the bell," I shouted to Jake over the deafening noise. He nodded, already moving towards the tower stairs. I followed, my legs burning with exhaustion. As we climbed, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. My vision began to blur, and I could feel something tugging at the edges of my mind, urging me to give in, to join the others in their eternal purgatory. Finally, we reached the bell chamber. The massive bronze bell swung back and forth of its own accord, each movement sending out another reality-warping toll. "How do we stop it?" Jake yelled, looking around desperately. I spotted a heavy piece of wood, probably part of the old bell frame. "There," I pointed. "We have to jam it." Together we lifted the beam, struggling to time our movements with the swing of the bell. On the count of 3, we shoved it forward, wedging it between the bell and its frame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world itself screaming in agony, the bell gave one final discordant toll and shattered. The explosion threw us back against the wall. As consciousness faded, I had one last fleeting thought. "Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the bell tolls for thee." But what happens when the bell stops tolling? Consciousness returned slowly, like wading through molasses. I blinked, my vision clearing to reveal the shattered remains of the bell chamber around us. Jake was stirring beside me, groaning as he pushed himself up. "Are we dead?" he mumbled, rubbing his head. I sat up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. "I don't think so. Though I'm not sure that's a good thing." The air felt different, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The otherworldly screech that had filled the air was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. "We should get out of here," I said, struggling to my feet. "See what's changed." Jake nodded, and together we made our way down the tower stairs. The church was empty, no sign of the spectral congregation we'd seen earlier. As we stepped outside, we were met with a sight that took our breath away. Whisper Creek was whole. The building stood pristine, as if newly built. The streets were clean, free of the decay and ruin we'd become accustomed to. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide. "Did we go back in time?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't think so. Look." I pointed to the sky. While it was no longer the swirling vortex of darkness, it wasn't quite right either. The blue was too vivid, almost painfully bright, and there were no clouds, no sun, just an endless expanse of color. "It's like a memory of a sky," I mused, "or an idea of what a sky should be." As we walked down the main street, I noticed something else odd. There were no people, no signs of life at all. The town was perfectly preserved, but utterly empty. "It's like a stage set," Jake said, voicing my thoughts. "All dressed up with nowhere to go." We made our way to the sheriff's office, drawn by the memory of the hidden message we'd seen in the mirror. The building was unlocked, and we stepped inside cautiously. Everything was in perfect order, a far cry from the cluttered, decaying office we'd hidden in before. Jake immediately went to the desk, rifling through the drawers. "There's got to be something here," he muttered. "Some clue about what really happened in this town." As he searched, I found myself drawn to a section of the floor behind the desk. Something about it seemed off. I knelt down, running my hands over the wooden planks. "Jake," I called. "I think there's something under here." Together we managed to pry up one of the floorboards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a stack of official-looking documents. Jackpot, Jake breathed, reaching for the papers. As we spread the documents out on the desk, a chilling picture began to emerge. Government memos, classified reports, and handwritten notes all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. It was an experiment, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They were trying to open a doorway. Jake nodded grimly, holding up one of the reports. Not just any doorway, a gateway to another dimension. They thought they could harness some kind of energy, use it as a weapon. But something went wrong. I continued, piecing it together. They opened the door, but they couldn't control what came through. We looked at each other, the full weight of the realization settling over us. Whisper Creek hadn't been struck by a plague. It had been ground zero for an invasion from another reality. As if triggered by our discovery, a low rumble began to shake the building. Books fell from shelves, and cracks started to appear in the walls. "We need to get out of here," Jake shouted, grabbing the journal and as many of the documents as he could. We ran out into the street only to find the perfect facade of the town crumbling around us. Buildings wavered like mirages, occasionally flickering to show their true decayed state. "The bunker," I yelled over the growing noise. "There's got to be a bunker." It was a guess, but an educated one. If this had been a government experiment, they would have had a secure facility to run it from. We raced through the disintegrating town, searching for anything that looked like it might lead underground. Just when I thought we were out of time, Jake spotted it. A heavy metal door set into the side of a hill at the edge of town. "There," he pointed. We sprinted towards it, the world literally falling apart behind us. I grabbed the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily under my hand. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the door shut just as a wave of unreality washed over the town. For a moment we stood in darkness, our ragged breathing the only sound. Then, with a hum, emergency lights flickered to life, revealing a long corridor stretching into the earth. "My God," Jake breathed. "It's real. It's all real." We made our way down the corridor, passing rooms filled with antiquated scientific equipment and banks of computers. At the end, we found what could only be the control center, a large room dominated by a massive screen and a control panel that looked like something out of a 1950s sci-fi movie. "This is where it happened," I said, running my hand over the dusty controls. "This is where they opened the door." Jake was at one of the computer terminals, somehow still operational after all these years. "Alex," he called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." I joined him, looking at the screen. It showed a video feed, date stamped July 15th, 1952, the day of the plague. We watched in horror as the scene unfolded. Scientists in white lab coats scurried around the control room, excitement clear on their faces. A man in a military uniform, a general by his insignia, stood watching with stern anticipation. "Initiating the portal now, sir," one of the scientists said, his hand hovering over a large red button. "Proceed." The general nodded. The scientist pressed the button, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a sound that made my teeth ache even through the grainy audio, a tear appeared in the air at the center of the room. "My God," one of the scientists breathed. "We've done it. We've opened a gateway to—" His words were cut off as something began to emerge from the portal. It was wrong, in a way that defied description. Tentacles, eyes, mouths all writhed together in a mass that hurt to look at. The room erupted into chaos. Scientists screamed, trying to shut down the equipment, but it was too late. The thing from the portal lashed out, grabbing the nearest person and absorbing them, for lack of a better word. "Shut it down," the general roared. "Shut it all down." But it was too late. The thing was fully in our world now, and it was changing. With each person it touched, it seemed to grow, to evolve. And those it didn't outright absorb began to change too, their eyes turning black, their movements becoming jerky and unnatural. The video cut out abruptly, leaving us staring at a blank screen. "They did this," Jake said, his voice shaking. "They brought that thing into our world. I nodded, my mind reeling. And now we're caught in the aftermath, trapped in a town where reality itself has been warped. A sudden noise from behind us made us both spin around. There in the doorway stood Sarah, but not the twisted, monstrous Sarah we'd last seen. This was Sarah as she had been when we first arrived in Whisper Creek, whole, human, and terrified. "Alex? Jake?" she said, her voice trembling. "What's happening? Where are we?" Before we could respond, her form flickered like a bad TV signal. For a moment, I saw the monstrous version of her overlaid on the human one. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice distorting. "It's got me. It's got all of us. You have to—" She vanished mid-sentence, leaving us alone in the control room. Jake and I looked at each other, the weight of our discovery pressing down on us. We were in the heart of the mystery now, surrounded by the truth of what had happened to Whisper Creek. But knowledge, it seemed, was not enough to save us. As if to underscore this point, a familiar whisper began to fill the air. "Join us. Join us. Join us." Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the truth is buried deep, and knowledge, well, knowledge might just be the most dangerous thing of all. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from the very walls of the bunker. Jake and I exchanged panicked glances, the realization sinking in that we were trapped underground with whatever horrors Whisper Creek had spawned. "We need to find a way out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There has to be another exit." Jake nodded, already moving towards the door. "Let's go. I don't want to stick around to see what happens when those whispers get any closer." We hurried down the corridor, checking each room we passed. Most were filled with more outdated scientific equipment or filing cabinets bursting with documents we didn't have time to examine. The whispers followed us, growing in volume and intensity with each passing moment. As we reached the end of the hallway, we found ourselves facing a heavy steel door. A keypad glowed faintly next to it, demanding a code we didn't have. "Damn it!" Jake slammed his fist against the unyielding metal. "We're trapped." I was about to suggest we go back and look for the code, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. The air in front of the door seemed to ripple, and suddenly Sarah was there again, her form wavering like a mirage. "Sarah?" I called out, taking a step towards her. She turned to face us, her eyes clear for a moment before flickering to the empty black voids we'd seen before. "Alex? Jake? You have to hurry. It's coming." "What's coming, Sarah?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. "How do we stop it?" Sarah's form flickered again, and for a moment I saw the twisted, monstrous version of her superimposed over her human self. "The code. It's in the past. You have to remember." Before she could say more, she vanished, leaving us alone in the corridor once more. The whispers had grown to a fever pitch, and I could swear I heard footsteps approaching from the way we'd come. "The past," I muttered, my mind racing. "What did she mean?" Jake's eyes widened suddenly. "The mirror. In the sheriff's office, remember? There were numbers scratched into it." I nodded, the memory flooding back. "But what were they? I can't remember." As if in response to our desperation, the world around us began to shift. The sterile walls of the bunker faded away, replaced by the familiar, decrepit interior of the sheriff's office. But it wasn't like before. Everything seemed hazy, insubstantial, like a dream half remembered. "What's happening?" Jake whispered, reaching out to touch a desk that wasn't quite there. "I think—" I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. "I think we're experiencing a memory. Or maybe we're slipping through time again." We made our way to the cell where we'd seen the mirror before. There it was, grimy and cracked, with the mysterious numbers etched into its surface. 7, 15, 19, 52. I read aloud, committing the sequence to memory. As soon as I'd spoken the last number, the world shifted again. We were back in the bunker corridor, facing the locked door. Without hesitation, I punched the numbers into the keypad, 7 to 15, 1952. The date the experiment had gone wrong. The date Whisper Creek had changed forever. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a hiss of hydraulics, the door slid open. "You did it!" Jake exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. We rushed through the doorway, finding ourselves in what looked like an emergency exit tunnel. A ladder at the far end led up to a hatch in the ceiling. As we ran towards it, the whispers behind us coalesced into a roar. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. A writhing mass of darkness was pouring into the tunnel, tentacles and mouths and too many eyes all blended together in a nightmarish amalgamation. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Jake towards the ladder. "Climb!" We scrambled up the rungs, the eldritch horror gaining on us with every second. Jake reached the hatch first, straining to turn the wheel that would open it. "It's stuck," he grunted, his face red with exertion. I joined him on the small platform, adding my strength to his. Slowly, agonizingly, the wheel began to turn. Below us, the first of the tentacles reached the base of the ladder. I could feel the malevolent intelligence behind it, probing, searching for us. With a final desperate heave, we managed to spin the wheel fully. The hatch popped open, and we tumbled out onto soft grass, slamming it shut behind us. For a moment, we just lay there, gasping for breath. The sky above was that unnatural, too bright blue we'd seen before. But right then, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "We made it," Jake panted, a hysterical note of laughter in his voice. We actually made it. But our relief was short-lived. As we got to our feet, we realized we were standing in the town square of Whisper Creek, and it was changing. Buildings flickered in and out of existence, sometimes pristine, sometimes decayed, sometimes warped into impossible geometries. The ground beneath our feet rippled like water, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. "It's falling apart," I realized, horror dawning. "Whatever was holding this place together, we've disrupted it." Jake nodded grimly. "So what do we do now?" Before I could answer, a familiar voice called out, "Alex! Jake!" We turned to see Mike running towards us. He looked haggard, his clothes torn and dirty, but his eyes were clear, human. "Mike!" I exclaimed as he reached us. "You're okay, but how?" He shook his head, gasping for breath. "No time to explain. We have to get to the school. There's something there, something important." "The school?" Jake frowned. "Why?" "I've been jumping," Mike said, his eyes darting around nervously. "Through time, through different versions of the town. I've seen things, learned things. There's a message hidden in the school, from someone who tried to stop this." Another violent tremor shook the town, nearly knocking us off our feet. In the distance, I could see the darkness we'd fled in the bunker starting to seep up through cracks in the ground. "Lead the way," I told Mike, "and hurry." We raced through the shifting landscape of Whisper Creek, the world around us becoming more unstable with each passing moment. Buildings melted and reformed, streets twisted into impossible angles, and everywhere the darkness spread, consuming everything it touched. We reached the school just as another tremor hit. The building wavered before our eyes, cycling through states of newness and decay. "In here!" Mike shouted, leading us to what had once been the principal's office. The room was a chaos of temporal shifts. With each flicker, the decor changed, spanning decades in the blink of an eye. Mike seemed unaffected, moving with purpose to a spot on the wall. "Here," he said, placing his hand on a section of wallpaper. "It's hidden, but I've seen it. We just need to wait for the right moment." As if on cue, the room shifted again. The wallpaper melted away, revealing bare plaster beneath. And there, scratched into the wall, was a message. "The bell is the key. Silence it to seal the rift. But beware, the price is high." "We already stopped the bell," Jake said, confusion clear in his voice. "Didn't we?" I shook my head slowly, a terrible understanding dawning. "No, we just interrupted it. We need to silence it permanently." Mike nodded grimly. "And I think I know how. But you're not going to like it." As Mike explained his plan, I felt a weight settle in my chest. He was right. I didn't like it. But as I looked out the window at the disintegrating town, at the encroaching darkness that threatened to consume not just Whisper Creek, but potentially the entire world, I knew we had no choice. "Let's do it," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. As we left the school, preparing to make our final stand against the horrors of Whisper Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking towards our doom. But sometimes, the only way to save everything is to be willing to sacrifice anything. Welcome to Whisper Creek, where the end is just another beginning, and salvation might come at a price too terrible to contemplate. The world around us was coming apart at the seams. Reality flickered and warped, buildings melting and reforming in grotesque parodies of themselves. The sky above had turned into a swirling vortex of unnatural colors, punctuated by flashes of otherworldly lightning. And through it all, the darkness spread, consuming everything in its path. Mike, Jake, and I raced through the chaos towards the church. Mike's plan was insane, desperate, and probably suicidal. But it was all we had. "Are you sure about this?" Jake shouted over the cacophony of a world tearing itself apart. Mike nodded grimly. "It's the only way. We have to close the rift, and the bell is the key. It's what's keeping the portal open." As we neared the church, I saw shapes moving in the shadows, twisted, half-formed things that had once been the people of Whisper Creek. They turned their eyeless faces towards us, mouths gaping in silent screams. "Don't look at them," I yelled. "Just keep moving." We burst through the church doors, slamming them shut behind us. The interior was a maelstrom of swirling energy, all of it centered on the bell tower. Each pulse sent out a wave of sickly green light, widening the tear in reality that hovered in the air. "Now what?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. Mike was already moving towards the tower stairs. "We climb. The bell has to be silenced permanently." As we ascended, the air grew thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. I could feel something tugging at the edges of my mind, urging me to give in, to join the others in their eternal purgatory. I shook my head, trying to clear it. We reached the bell chamber, and I felt my heart sink. The bell, which we had shattered earlier, was whole again. It swung back and forth of its own accord, each toll sending out another reality-warping pulse. "How is this possible?" I gasped. Mike's face was grim. "Time isn't linear here anymore. What we did before, it never happened, or it's happening now, or it will happen, it's all the same." "So what do we do?" Jake demanded. Mike took a deep breath. "We have to merge with it." Jake and I stared at him in shock. "What?" I managed to choke out. "The bell is a conduit," Mike explained, his words coming fast now. "It's connected to whatever's on the other side of that rift. If we can merge with it, become part of it, we can control it, silence it from within." "That's insane," Jake protested. "We'll be killed." Mike shook his head. "Not killed, transformed. We'll become part of Whisper Creek's story, but we'll be able to end it." I looked at the bell, swinging in its terrible rhythm, then back at my friends. The choice was impossible, but there was no choice at all. "I'll do it," I said, stepping forward. "Alex, no." Jake grabbed my arm. I turned to him, seeing the fear and desperation in his eyes. "It has to be done, Jake. And it has to be me." "Why?" he demanded. I smiled sadly. "Because I'm the one telling the story." Before he could stop me, I broke free and ran towards the bell. As I neared it, I felt the air around me grow thick, as if I were moving through molasses. The bell's tolling filled my head, drowning out everything else. With the last of my strength, I leapt, throwing myself into the path of the swinging bell. For a moment, I felt the cold metal against my skin. Then the world exploded into light and pain. I was everywhere and nowhere. I was the bell. I was the church. I was Whisper Creek itself. I saw the town's history flash before me, its founding, its growth, the terrible experiment that had doomed it. I saw the entities from beyond the rift, their alien minds brushing against mine in a way that threatened to shatter my sanity. And I saw the way out. With what was left of my consciousness, I focused on the bell, on silencing it, on closing the rift that had torn reality apart. The tolling slowed, each ring coming further apart. As it did, I felt the fabric of reality begin to knit itself back together. The rift started to close, the otherworldly energies retreating back to their own dimension. But the entities fought back. They clawed at the closing rift, desperate to maintain their foothold in our world. I felt their alien minds pressing against mine, trying to break my will. In that moment, I understood the true horror of Whisper Creek. It wasn't just a town trapped in time. It was a battleground between realities with the soul of every inhabitant as the prize. "Alex!" I heard Jake's voice, distant and fading. "Alex, come back to us." I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But I knew that if I let go now, everything would be lost. Whisper Creek would fall, and the rest of the world would follow. So I held on. I poured everything I had into that final desperate act, silencing the bell, closing the rift, saving what was left of Whisper Creek and the world beyond. The tolling slowed further. Seconds stretched between each ring, each one weaker than the last. The rift was nearly closed now, a mere pinprick in the fabric of reality. With the last of my strength, I gave one final push. The bell rang out one last time, a sound so soft it was barely a whisper. And then, silence. The rift closed with a sound like the world itself sighing in relief. I felt the alien presences recede, pushed back to their own reality. Whisper Creek shuddered, decades of twisted time and space realigning themselves. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the bell tower. Jake and Mike were kneeling beside me, their faces etched with worry. "Alex?" Jake said, his voice choked with emotion. "Are you?" "You?" I sat up slowly, every part of me aching. "I think so." "What happened?" Mike helped me to my feet. "You did it. The rift is closed. Whisper Creek is, well, it's not fixed, but it's stable." We made our way down the tower stairs and out of the church. The town outside was a mess of broken buildings and debris, but it was real, solid. No more flickering realities or temporal shifts. As we stood there, taking in the scene, we heard a sound that made us all freeze. Helicopter rotors, growing louder. "Is that?" Jake began. I nodded, a smile spreading across my face despite everything. "Rescue, it's over, we're going home." As the helicopter came into view, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We had survived. We had saved Whisper Creek, and perhaps the world. But I knew that the experience would stay with us forever. The chopper landed in the town square, and as the rescue team approached us, I turned to take one last look at the town. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw familiar faces watching us from the windows of the broken buildings. Sarah, the old sheriff, all the lost souls of Whisper Creek, finally at peace. Then they were gone, and it was just a town, a broken, haunted town, but no longer a threat to reality itself. As we were led to the helicopter, I heard Jake ask, "What do we tell them about what happened here?" I shook my head. "The truth. All of it. The world needs to know." Mike nodded in agreement. "No more secrets. No more experiments. Whisper Creek's story needs to be told." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying us away from the nightmare we'd endured, I looked down at the rapidly shrinking town. In that moment, I made a silent promise. To remember, to warn others, to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Welcome to Whisper Creek, I thought. A town with a story to tell. A story of horror, of courage, of the thin line between reality and nightmare. And now, finally, a story with an ending. As we flew towards home, towards safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't truly over, that somehow, somewhere, the echoes of Whisper Creek would resonate for years to come. But for now, we had won. We had survived. And that in itself was a victory worth celebrating. The end? Or is it just the beginning?